We were sitting around the grand mahogany dining table that my money had paid for, surrounded by my son-in-law's wealthy investors. He raised his crystal glass, looked right at me with a smirk, and jokingly called me his pension-draining roommate. Laughter echoed through the room. I swallowed the bitter humiliation, keeping my mouth shut, for the sake of my daughter and my grandson. But then my 8-year-old grandson Leo pointed at his father's brand-new diamond-encrusted watch and whispered 3 words that made the entire room freeze. "You sold it." That was the moment the smoke cleared. That was the moment I realized the man sitting across from me was not just a disrespectful son-in-law. He was a monster who had already stolen my past and was actively auctioning off my family's future. My name is Calvin. I am 68 years old, a proud African-American man, and a retired fire captain from the south side of Chicago. For 35 years, I ran into burning buildings to pull strangers out of the flames. I knew how to read a fire. I knew how a tiny spark behind a drywall could quietly devour a whole house before you even smelled the smoke. But God help me, I never realized the biggest fire of my life was burning down my own family from the inside. When my beautiful wife passed away 3 years ago, my world went entirely dark. The house we had built together felt empty and cold, without her voice filling the rooms. The only light I had left in this world was my daughter Sarah and my young grandson Leo. I wanted to make sure they never had to struggle the way we did coming up. I wanted to give them the world. So when Sarah's husband Derek came to me with a grand presentation for a new tech startup, I listened. Derek was a smooth talker. He wore sharp suits, flashed a charming smile, and laid out spreadsheets promising that this business would secure Sarah and Leo for generations to come. He just needed seed money. A lot of it. I did what I thought any loving father would do. I made the ultimate sacrifice. I sold the home my wife and I had spent our entire lives paying off. Every drop of sweat, every dangerous double shift at the firehouse, every holiday I missed with my family went into those bricks. I took all that money, the absolute foundation of my life's work, and handed it over to Derek. In return, he promised me a permanent place in their sprawling new home. He shook my hand, looked me dead in the eye, and told me I would enjoy a peaceful retirement, watching my grandson grow up under his roof. I trusted him completely. I gave him everything I had. But the harsh truth of this world is that a snake does not change its nature just because you feed it. Almost the minute the bank transfer cleared, the atmosphere in that house shifted. The harmonious family arrangement Derek had promised quickly evaporated. I thought I was moving in to be the respected patriarch. Instead, I became their unpaid live-in nanny, their personal chef, and their housekeeper. Derek's charming smile vanished, replaced by quiet disdain and daily disrespect. He began treating me not as the man who funded his entire lifestyle, but as a charity case who was overstaying his welcome. He would complain about the cost of groceries while pouring himself expensive scotch. He would roll his eyes if I asked him to turn down the television late at night. He spoke to me slowly, using a condescending tone, acting as if my age had somehow robbed me of my intelligence. I endured the microaggressions. I swallowed the sharp remarks. I let him treat me like a burden because of the pure, unconditional love I have for Sarah and the bright, innocent smile of my grandson Leo. I convinced myself that a true father's sacrifice is meant to be silent. I told myself that enduring his disrespect was the price I had to pay to keep my daughter's family intact. What hurt the most was watching what Derek was doing to Sarah. My daughter used to be so full of life, a strong, confident black woman who never backed down from a challenge. But living with Derek had changed her. She became quiet, anxious, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid triggering his temper. Whenever he belittled me, she would just look down at the floor, completely silenced, by his domineering presence. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the invisible weight she was carrying on her shoulders. I wanted to grab her, to tell her she did not have to live in fear, but I was trapped. I had given away my independence to build their castle, and now I was nothing but a ghost haunting its halls. I woke up early every single morning to make breakfast for Leo, packing his lunch and walking him to the bus stop. Those morning walks were my only sanctuary. Leo would hold my hand and tell me about his school projects, his favorite comic books, and his dreams of becoming a firefighter, just like his grandpa. His joy was my oxygen. I told myself that as long as Leo was happy and safe, my sacrifice was worth it. I pushed down the aching in my joints and the heavy sorrow in my chest. I tried to be the invisible pillar holding up their roof, but I was wrong to stay silent. I was wrong to turn a blind eye to the disrespect. Because men like Derek do not respect sacrifice. They only recognize weakness. They view kindness as an invitation to take more. I did not know it yet, but my silent endurance was only giving him the cover he needed to execute a plan so wicked, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it would force me to step back into the flames one last time. The arrangement was supposed to be a blessing. That was the word Derek used when he handed me the keys to the guest suite in the sprawling modern house my life savings had just secured for them. A blessing. He painted a picture of a golden retirement, where I could rest my weary bones, tend to a small garden, and watch my grandson grow up wrapped in the warmth of a multi-generational home. It sounded like the perfect reward after decades of breathing in smoke and ash. But dreams have a funny way of evaporating the moment the sun comes up. And in that house, the sun came up early, bringing with it a reality I never saw coming. I quickly learned that I had not moved in to be the respected elder of the family. I had paid my own money to become their full-time, unpaid employee. My day did not start with a peaceful cup of coffee on the back porch. It started at 5 in the morning. While Derek and Sarah were still fast asleep in the master bedroom upstairs, I was down in the kitchen. I spent 35 years hauling heavy hoses up blazing stairwells, and now my aching knees were bending to scrub granite countertops and load the dishwasher. I became the live-in chef, the housekeeper, and the nanny, all rolled into one tired old man. Derek made sure to frame it differently, of course. Whenever his slick startup friends came over for weekend barbecues, he would throw an arm around my shoulder, flash that blinding smile, and tell everyone how he took in his aging father-in-law to give me a better life. He made it sound like I was a stray dog he rescued from the cold. He completely erased the fact that the very roof over their heads was built on the ashes of my sold home. I stood there flipping burgers on his fancy grill, listening to him rewrite history, and I kept my mouth tightly shut. The disrespect was rarely a loud shout. It was a slow, quiet poison. It lived in the subtle microaggressions Derek deployed every single day. If I bought a brand of orange juice he did not prefer, he would let out a heavy sigh, pinch the bridge of his nose, and leave the carton sitting on the counter like a piece of garbage. He would complain loudly about the rising cost of utilities right outside my bedroom door, making sure I heard him. If I struggled to figure out the complicated smart thermostat he installed, he would roll his eyes and snatch his phone to adjust the temperature, muttering under his breath about how modern technology was simply too much for someone my age. He spoke to me slowly, articulating his words, as if my hearing was failing, completely stripping away my dignity piece by piece. And Sarah, my beautiful, strong daughter, she was fading right before my eyes. The fiery, confident black woman I raised was disappearing into the shadow of her husband's oversized ego. Whenever Derek directed his quiet venom at me, I would look to her, hoping she would step in, but she would just drop her gaze to the floor. She walked on eggshells in her own home, constantly trying to smooth things over, constantly apologizing for things that were not her fault. I could see the exhaustion weighing down her spirit. She was trapped in a dynamic where she felt she owed him everything, and my presence was just one more thing she had to manage. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and remind her of her worth, but my hands were tied. I had given up my kingdom to build theirs, and a king without a castle has no voice, so I swallowed my pride. I chewed on the bitter pill of humiliation every single day, and I did it for one reason alone. Leo. My 8-year-old grandson was the absolute light of my fading life. He was a bright, energetic boy with a smile that could melt the thickest ice. Every morning after I packed his lunchbox, I would walk him down the long driveway to the school bus stop. Those 10 minutes were my sanctuary. Leo would hold my giant, calloused hand in his small fingers and talk a mile a minute. He would tell me about his science projects, his favorite superheroes, and how he wanted to be a brave firefighter, just like his grandpa when he grew up. He would wear a plastic red fire helmet I bought him for his birthday, marching proudly down the sidewalk. When I looked at Leo, the pain in my back disappeared. The sting of Derek's insults faded away. I told myself that this was what fathers and grandfathers do. We absorb the blows so our families do not have to feel them. We carry the heavy loads in silence. I convinced myself that true sacrifice does not ask for applause. I reasoned that if my daily humiliation bought Leo a stable home, a good school, and a future without the financial struggles I faced, then I would gladly be the floor mat they walked on. I justified the disrespect as the necessary cost of admission to stay in my grandson's life. I kept my head down. I focused on making the perfect pancakes for Leo and keeping the house spotless for Sarah. I thought my silence was protecting them. I thought I was keeping the peace. But a man can only bend so far before his spine begins to crack. I did not realize that my willingness to be treated like a burden was only feeding a monster. Derek did not view my silence as an act of noble love. He viewed it as a surrender. He saw an old man who had given up all his leverage, a man who was too tired and too devoted to fight back. And in his greedy mind, an old man who refuses to fight is simply a target waiting to be drained of whatever he has left. The air in the house was thick with a heavy, suffocating tension on the morning of the dinner party. Derek had announced earlier that week that he was bringing over a group of heavy-hitting venture capitalists for his tech startup. He made it very clear from the moment he woke up that this was not a casual family gathering, but a high-stakes performance meant to secure more funding. He did not hire a professional catering service to handle the extravagant menu he had planned. Instead, he dropped a premium grocery store credit card on the kitchen island and handed me a long, printed list of complex recipes. I was a man who had commanded an entire firehouse in the heart of Chicago, who had organized rescue missions in collapsing structures and pulled breathless children from burning bedrooms. But in this sprawling modern house, I was firmly relegated to the role of a silent, obedient servant. I spent 2 grueling days preparing the feast. My old knees ached fiercely as I stood on the hard tile floor for hours on end, chopping organic vegetables, marinating a massive prime rib roast, and polishing the expensive imported silverware that my own life savings had originally purchased. I poured my heart and soul into the food because I wanted the evening to go perfectly for my daughter Sarah. I wanted her to feel proud of her home and to experience a single night of peace. But the physical exhaustion in my joints was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological weight pressing down on my chest. I was carefully cooking a lavish feast for the exact man who was slowly and methodically dismantling my dignity every single day. When the doorbell finally rang that evening, the house was instantly invaded by the loud, booming voices of men who had never known a hard day of manual labor in their entire lives. I could hear the low rumble of their luxury cars pulling into the long circular driveway. They walked through the front doors, wearing custom-tailored suits that cost more than I used to make in a month, smelling strongly of expensive cologne and imported cigars. They were wealthy, highly privileged, and completely oblivious to anything outside their elite tax bracket. Derek greeted them with his signature blinding smile, playing the role of the ultimate gracious and successful host. He poured glasses of aged scotch from the crystal decanter and laughed loudly, throwing his head back in a practiced display of total arrogance. I stood quietly in the background, near the kitchen archway, wearing a clean but modest button-down shirt, making sure the appetizer trays were consistently full. When I walked around the room offering crab cakes and stuffed mushrooms, none of the guests bothered to look me in the eye. When they took food from the silver platters, they did not say thank you or acknowledge my presence. To them, I was merely part of the expensive furniture, a hired hand meant to fade into the wallpaper. But what truly broke my heart was watching my daughter. Sarah stood near the edge of the massive living room, holding a glass of sparkling water, like a protective shield against her chest. She wore a beautiful evening dress, but her shoulders were hunched and her bright smile did not reach her tired eyes. She looked exactly like a prisoner trapped inside a gilded cage, jumping slightly every time Derek raised his voice or moved quickly across the room. She was terrified of making even the smallest mistake in front of his important business friends. I served the main course, carrying the heavy porcelain dishes from the hot kitchen to the grand mahogany dining table. I carefully placed the perfectly roasted meat in the center, surrounded by steaming bowls of gourmet sides. I then took my designated seat at the very far end of the long table closest to the kitchen door, so I could easily jump up to clear the plates and refill water glasses. The conversation echoing around me was an exhausting blur of profit margins, golf course handicaps, offshore accounts, and summer homes in the Hamptons. Derek was holding court at the head of the table, commanding the attention of every man in the room. He was bragging endlessly about his brilliant business acumen, painting a grandiose picture of himself as a self-made genius who had clawed his way to the top through sheer willpower and unmatched intellect. It took every single ounce of restraint I possessed to keep a straight face and chew my food. His entire financial empire, the sturdy roof over his head, the rich food on his plate, the very leather chair he was sitting on, was built entirely on the ashes of my souled family home. But I chewed my roasted vegetables in silence, focusing my gaze on the intricate wood grain of the dining table, keeping my posture neutral. Then the conversation shifted to real estate and personal assets. One of the older wealthy investors, a slick man with a deep artificial tan and a booming theatrical laugh, asked Derek a direct question. He pointed his silver fork around the lavishly decorated dining room and asked how a young guy managed to secure such a massive, pristine property so early in his startup career. The entire room went dead quiet, waiting for the young genius to share his secret to success. Derek leaned far back in his leather chair, swirled the expensive red wine in his crystal glass, and let out a smug, arrogant chuckle. He locked his cold, dead eyes directly on me from across the entire length of the table, ensuring I saw the malice in his gaze. He smirked widely and told the group of men that building massive wealth is easy when you have a live-in mascot. He actually used those exact words. Then he raised his glass toward the chandelier and loudly proclaimed that every successful entrepreneur needs a charity project to give back to the community, and his just happened to be his pension-draining roommate who came with the house. He finished by saying he was just doing his civic duty for the elderly and homeless. The entire dining room erupted. The wealthy men slapped the mahogany table, roaring with deep belly laughter at the pathetic old man sitting quietly at the end of the board. They eagerly raised their crystal glasses in a unified toast to Derek, praising his incredible generosity, his big heart, and his fantastic sense of humor. The sound of their cruel laughter bounced off the high vaulted ceilings and rang in my ears like a blaring, heavy emergency fire alarm. I looked immediately across the table at Sarah, my brilliant, beautiful daughter. The strong woman I had protected with my life since she was a baby simply lowered her head. She stared blankly down at her half-eaten food, her hands gripping a linen napkin in her lap. Her cheeks were burning bright red with deep, profound shame, but she did not speak a single word. She did not raise her voice to defend her father. She was completely silenced by the domineering, abusive shadow of her husband. My blood began to physically boil beneath my skin. A massive, overwhelming wave of pure heat rushed through my veins, flooding my system with adrenaline. My heart hammered against my ribs with the raw, destructive force of a steel battering ram. The veteran firefighter inside me, the commander who had kicked down solid oak burning doors and carried helpless people through raging infernos, screamed at me to stand up. I wanted to flip that heavy mahogany table right onto their custom-tailored suits. I wanted to march to the head of the table, grab Derek by his expensive silk tie, and aggressively inform those rich, ignorant fools exactly whose hard-earned money had paid for the fine wine they were currently choking on. My fists clenched so tightly under the table that my aging knuckles turned bone white, and my fingernails dug deep into my palms until I felt the sharp, stinging pain of broken skin. The pressure building in my chest was absolute, pure agony. But then I caught a tiny flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I looked past the brightly lit dining room toward the dark hallway staircase, and I saw a small shadow standing on the steps. It was Leo. My sweet 8-year-old grandson was peeking through the wooden banister, watching the adults in complete, terrified silence. If I exploded right then, if I let the raging fire out and destroyed Derek in front of his wealthy investors, the fallout would be catastrophic for my family. Derek would unleash his humiliated, furious rage on Sarah the exact moment the guests walked out the front door. He would turn this house into a toxic, screaming war zone for my innocent grandson. So I took a slow, deep, agonizing breath, pulling the cold air into my burning lungs. I deliberately forced my shaking hands to unclench one finger at a time. I swallowed a thick, heavy lump of humiliation so bitter and sharp, it felt exactly like swallowing crushed glass. I sat there in complete stillness, absorbing their intense disrespect, taking the vicious mockery, and willingly becoming the pathetic punchline to their cruel joke, all to keep the fragile peace for the two people I loved most in this world. The booming laughter of those wealthy men was still echoing off the crystal chandelier when the heavy oak door leading to the hallway slowly creaked open. The sound was faint, and barely a whisper against the loud clinking of expensive glassware, but my ears caught it immediately. Out from the shadows of the staircase stepped Leo. He was wearing his oversized dinosaur pajamas, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear tightly to his chest. His small bare feet padded softly against the cold hardwood floor. He rubbed his sleepy eyes, blinking against the harsh, glaring lights of the dining room. The men at the table were too busy congratulating Derek on his ruthless business tactics to notice the boy. But Derek saw him. The arrogant smirk on my son-in-law's face twitched, faltering for just a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered, pasting on a tight, artificial grin. He waved his hand, gesturing for Leo to come closer, playing the role of the doting father for his rich audience. "Come here, buddy, and say hello to my associates," Derek said, his tone dripping with fake, thick affection. Leo hesitated, looking at me first from across the long room. I gave him a gentle, reassuring nod, though my own heart was still hammering against my ribs from the intense humiliation I had just swallowed. Leo shuffled forward slowly, approaching the head of the table where his father sat, enthroned in leather and pure arrogance. The men at the table leaned in, offering patronizing smiles and hollow, empty compliments about how big the boy was getting. Derek reached out and placed his hand on Leo's small shoulder, pulling him into a side hug that looked entirely unnatural and staged. As Derek moved his arm, the sleeve of his custom-tailored suit jacket pulled back, catching the bright overhead light. A massive, heavy chunk of metal and diamonds gleamed on his wrist. It was a brand-new custom Rolex, the kind of watch that cost more than a reliable car or a down payment on a house. The diamonds encrusted around the bezel caught the light and threw tiny, sharp reflections across the polished mahogany table. Leo's gaze dropped immediately to his father's wrist. The boy stopped moving. He did not say hello to the wealthy guests. He did not smile at their fake compliments. His innocent brown eyes locked onto that glittering watch with a strange, unblinking intensity. The noisy, boisterous chatter around the table began to fade. One by one, the rich investors noticed the boy's bizarre silence. The clinking of silver forks stopped completely. A heavy, deeply uncomfortable quiet settled over the room, replacing the loud laughter from just moments ago. Leo reached out with his small, trembling finger and pointed directly at the heavy gold and diamond timepiece. He looked up slowly, meeting his father's eyes. The room was so incredibly silent that I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator all the way in the kitchen. Then Leo spoke. His voice was soft and fragile, but it carried across that long dining table like a sudden thunderclap. You sold it. 3 simple words. You sold it. But the impact they had on that room was nothing short of explosive. The fake, charming mask Derek wore so perfectly completely shattered into 1,000 pieces. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale white. For a split second, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Absolute, pure, unadulterated panic. The wealthy men exchanged confused, awkward glances, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive seats. What did he sell? Derek, one of the older investors, asked, letting out a nervous chuckle, trying to break the sudden freezing tension. But Derek did not laugh. His panic instantly morphed into a violent, explosive rage. Before anyone could blink, Derek's hand shot out. He grabbed Leo's fragile wrist with a terrifying, vicious force. His knuckles turned bone white as he squeezed, digging his fingers deep into the boy's thin arm. Leo let out a sharp, painful gasp, dropping his stuffed bear to the floor. Get upstairs right now, Derek hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous, trembling growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. I said, get out of here. Sarah gasped, jumping up from her chair. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, but she was too paralyzed by years of psychological fear to intervene. My restraint completely vanished. The promise I made to myself to stay silent evaporated into thin air. I crossed that dining room in 3 massive strides. I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. But I stepped directly behind Derek and clamped my large, calloused hand down hard on his shoulder, applying a specific, calculated pressure that I knew would send a shooting pain down his collarbone. Let the boy go, I commanded, my voice dropping into the deep, authoritative tone I used when giving orders in a burning building. You are hurting him. Derek flinched, releasing Leo's arm, as if he had been physically burned. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, wild energy. For a moment, I thought he was going to swing at me right there in front of his billionaire friends. But he just smoothed down his expensive silk tie, forcing a sickeningly sweet smile back onto his face. The boy is just tired, Derek announced to the room, his voice trembling slightly. He has an overactive imagination. Past his bedtime. I did not look at the guests. I did not offer any polite excuses. I crouched down, scooped Leo up into my arms, and carried him away from that table of vultures. I carried my grandson up the long, winding staircase, his small body shaking against my chest. He buried his face in my neck, silently crying into my collar. When we reached his bedroom, I sat him down gently on the edge of his mattress. I rolled up his pajama sleeve and checked his arm where Derek had grabbed him. An angry red mark was already blooming on his brown skin. A wave of profound, sickening nausea washed over me. I pulled Leo into a tight, fierce hug, smoothing his hair and whispering that he was safe, that Grandpa had him. I stayed there holding him until his breathing finally slowed down and his small, tired eyes fluttered shut in exhaustion. But I did not sleep. I walked out into the dark hallway and sat down on the top step of the stairs, my mind racing 100 miles a minute. 35 years of fighting fires in Chicago teaches a man a very specific set of survival skills. You learn very quickly that visible flames are rarely the first sign of mortal danger. Before you ever see the fire, you feel the intense heat radiating through a solid wall. Before you see the blaze, you smell the bitter, toxic scent of invisible smoke creeping under the floorboards. As I sat there in the dark, the smell of smoke was absolutely overwhelming. Derek's reaction downstairs was not just the anger of an embarrassed father. It was the raw, desperate terror of a guilty man caught in a massive lie. He had lost complete control of himself over 3 simple words from an 8-year-old child. You sold it. What did he sell? I racked my brain trying to piece the puzzle together. Leo was a smart, highly observant boy. He spent hours with me in the garage looking at the vintage 1969 Mustang I had meticulously restored with my own 2 hands. It was the car I had explicitly and legally promised would be kept in a trust for Leo when he turned 18. I suddenly remembered that I had noticed the garage doors had been firmly locked for the past 3 weeks. Derek claimed he was having the security system updated and that no one was allowed inside. But my gut told me that was a lie. My instincts screamed that the diamond watch on Derek's wrist was paid for by something incredibly precious. But even then, my mind was only scratching the surface of the nightmare. If Derek was willing to secretly sell his own son's inheritance to buy luxury jewelry, to show off to his investors, what else was he hiding behind his charming smile? If he was willing to physically hurt a child to keep him quiet in front of company, how deep did this dark deception truly go? The humiliating joke at dinner no longer mattered to me. The daily disrespect no longer mattered. A dangerous, unseen fire was actively raging behind the walls of this beautiful, expensive house. And sitting there in the cold, dark hallway, I knew exactly what I had to do. I could not fight an enemy I could not see. I had to find the source of the smoke. I had to find out exactly what else my son-in-law had sold before the whole house burned down around us. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway softly chimed twice. It was exactly 2 in the morning. I was lying flat on my back in the tiny guest room, staring up at the stark, blank ceiling. Every single muscle in my aging body was completely rigid. I could still feel the phantom heat of my grandson trembling against my chest from earlier that evening. I could still clearly see the terrified look in Leo's brown eyes and the angry red mark blossoming on his small arm where his own father had viciously grabbed him. Those 3 tiny words he whispered at the dinner table kept echoing in the silent darkness of the room over and over again. You sold it. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. When you spend over 3 decades commanding a busy firehouse in Chicago, you develop a highly tuned internal radar for impending disaster. You learn to recognize the subtle, dangerous shift in air pressure before a room flashes over. You learn to trust that deeply unsettling feeling in your gut when a seemingly stable floor is about to give way beneath your heavy boots. Right now, my gut was practically screaming at me. Derek had panicked at the dinner table. That smooth, arrogant facade he wore so perfectly had cracked wide open, revealing a desperate, cornered animal hiding in plain sight. I threw off the thin cotton blanket and sat up on the edge of the mattress. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to find them. I quietly slipped my feet into my rubber-soled slippers and slowly opened the bedroom door. The sprawling, modern mansion was pitch black and dead silent. The wealthy investors had left hours ago, taking their loud, artificial laughter and expensive cigars with them. Sarah and Derek were fast asleep in the massive master suite at the far opposite end of the upper floor. I moved down the long, carpeted hallway, placing each step with deliberate, calculated precision. I knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which ones were solid. I had spent the last 6 months cleaning this massive house top to bottom, mapping its flaws while being treated like a ghost by the man who owned it. Now I was going to move like one. I made my way down the grand, winding staircase, gripping the cold iron banister. The pale moonlight spilled through the huge floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, stretched shadows across the imported hardwood floors. I walked past the extravagant living room, avoiding the expensive modern furniture that my sacrificed retirement savings had helped purchase. My destination was at the very back of the ground floor. Derek's private home office. It was his sanctuary, his personal fortress of arrogance. He strictly forbade anyone from entering, claiming his tech startup documents were highly classified and sensitive. He even kept the heavy, solid mahogany door locked at all times. But a locked wooden door is merely a suggestion to a man who spent his entire adult life breaching reinforced steel frames to rescue trapped citizens. I stood in front of the imposing office door and pressed my ear against the cool wood. There was nothing but total silence from the other side. I pulled a thin, rigid piece of stiff plastic from my pajama pocket. It was an old trick I learned during my rookie years at the fire department, a simple, non-destructive bypass method for standard spring latches. I wedged the plastic into the narrow gap between the door and the heavy frame, wiggling it gently downward toward the striking mechanism. My heart hammered a steady, frantic rhythm against my ribs. If Derek woke up to get a glass of water and found me breaking into his private sanctuary, the situation would turn explosive instantly. He would use it as the perfect excuse to kick me out into the street and cut me off from Sarah and Leo forever. I held my breath, applying steady downward pressure against the lock. A sharp, metallic click echoed softly in the quiet hallway. The lock disengaged. I turned the brass handle, slowly pushing the heavy door open just enough to slip my body inside before pulling it silently shut behind me. The office smelled faintly of expensive leather and arrogance. The heavy blackout curtains were tightly drawn, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small tactical pen light, clicking it on. The narrow beam of crisp white light swept across the room, illuminating a massive glass desk, a wall of thick legal books, and a sleek, modern steel filing cabinet tucked into the far corner. I moved straight toward the cabinet. It was a heavy-duty model, the kind designed to keep serious secrets safely buried. I tugged gently at the top drawer. Locked. Of course it was. Derek was far too paranoid to leave his personal files completely exposed to the world. I knelt down on the plush carpet, examining the small cylindrical lock on the top right corner. I did not have my heavy breaching tools, but I had patience and sheer determination. I pulled a small flathead screwdriver from my pocket, a handy tool I always carried out of pure habit. I wedged the flat metal tip into the top edge of the upper drawer, creating a tiny gap between the metal frame and the sliding track. I applied firm, steady leverage, pressing my body weight against the cold steel. The metal groaned softly, protesting the applied force. I pushed harder, ignoring the sharp shooting pain flaring up in my arthritic shoulder. With a sudden dull pop, the internal locking bar bent just enough to release the security catch. The heavy drawer slid smoothly open on its metal tracks. I aimed my penlight directly inside. The drawer was packed tight with perfectly labeled manila folders. Bank statements, utility bills, tax filings for the startup company. I quickly thumbed through the first few folders, pulling out dense pages of boring financial jargon. Nothing seemed immediately out of the ordinary. It was just routine corporate paperwork. But my deep instincts told me to keep digging. Derek was a master of presentation. He always put the clean, shiny things right up front to distract you from the rot hiding underneath. I pushed the mundane folders aside, reaching deep into the very back of the long steel drawer. My fingers brushed against a thick, heavy padded envelope, hidden entirely out of plain sight, behind a stack of blank printer paper. I pulled the envelope out and quickly opened the metal clasp. I slid the documents out, holding the penlight steady over the pages. The official embossed seal of the State Department of Motor Vehicles stared right back at me. I read the thick, bold print at the very top of the page. Bill of sale. I moved the light down, scanning the vehicle identification number and the detailed description. Year 1969. Make Ford. Model Mustang. Color raven black. The air completely left my lungs. My chest tightened so violently I had to grab the edge of the heavy steel cabinet to keep from falling over onto the floor. That car was not just a piece of metal and rubber. It was my absolute heart. It was the classic American muscle car I had purchased decades ago when I first made captain at the station. I had spent countless weekends in my old garage with thick black grease on my hands, rebuilding the engine piece by piece. When my wife was still alive, we used to take it for long Sunday drives down the coast, listening to the radio. When she got sick and I had to sell everything else selling, that car was the only thing I actively refused to do. I legally placed it into a protected trust specifically meant for Leo when he turned 18. It was supposed to be my lasting legacy to my grandson, a symbol of hard work and enduring love. Derek had smiled right in my face and assured me he would store the Mustang safely in a climate-controlled facility until Leo was old enough to drive it. I stared in pure horror at the signatures on the bottom of the page. The buyer was some wealthy private collector located in California. The purchase price was listed at $85,000. The date of the sale was over 4 months ago. And right there on the seller line was my name, Calvin, signed in bright blue ink. Only it was not my handwriting. The loops were too perfect, the slant entirely wrong. Derek had completely forged my signature. He had stolen my legacy, sold it to a stranger across the country, and used the cash to buy himself a diamond-encrusted Rolex to flaunt in front of his arrogant friends. And he had physically hurt my young grandson to keep him from exposing the truth at the dinner table. The betrayal was so deep, so utterly vile, that a wave of pure physical nausea washed over me. I wanted to march upstairs, drag that monster out of his expensive bed, and make him answer for what he had done. But the roaring fire inside me forced me to stay perfectly focused. If Derek was brazen enough to forge a federal document, to steal a classic car, he was undoubtedly hiding much more. I shoved the bill of sale back into the padded envelope and reached even deeper into the dark recess of the steel drawer. My hand hit the cold metal back wall of the cabinet. I felt around the bottom edge, pressing my fingertips against the floor of the drawer. There was a false bottom. A thin piece of rigid cardboard taped flat against the steel. I dug my fingernails under the rough edge and ripped it away. Underneath the cardboard, sitting in a shallow, hidden depression, lay 2 objects that made my racing heart beat even faster. The first was a small, black, leather-bound ledger the kind people use to keep handwritten notes completely off the digital grid. The second was a cheap plastic prepaid cell phone, a burner device you can buy with cash at any corner convenience store. Men who run legitimate, successful tech startups do not hide burner phones and secret ledgers in false compartments behind forged documents. They do not operate in the shadows unless they are actively covering up something highly illegal and incredibly dangerous. I stared down at the two items resting in my calloused palm, realizing the terrifying scope of the situation. The smoke had finally cleared, and the raging fire was staring me right in the face. Derek was not just an arrogant, disrespectful son-in-law. He was a calculated criminal. I reached into my pocket to pull out my own cell phone, needing to take photographs of this massive discovery before the evidence disappeared. The black leather ledger and the cheap prepaid burner phone rested in my calloused palms, heavy with unseen malice. I had spent 35 years on a fire engine on the south side of Chicago, and my hands knew the weight of dangerous tools. But these objects felt infinitely more destructive. I set the burner phone gently on the carpeted floor and carefully opened the thick ledger. The binding cracked slightly under my thumbs. It was a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the dead, suffocating silence of the office. I shined the narrow, focused beam of my tactical penlight onto the very first page. It was completely filled with rows of meticulously handwritten numbers, dates, and account routing codes. It was not a simple notebook. It was a highly detailed master blueprint of financial slaughter. My eyes scanned the top of the first page and stopped dead on the name of my personal credit union. It was the exact institution I had used since I was a young rookie hauling heavy hoses up blazing stairwells. I turned the page and pulled a thick, folded stack of stapled papers out from the tight binding. The colored logo printed at the top of the first page belonged to a major national bank. I flattened the crisp, formal pages against the cold glass surface of the massive desk. The bold black letters printed across the top of the official document read, "Reverse Mortgage and Asset Liquidation Agreement." I felt the oxygen violently leave my lungs. I traced the beam of light down to the bottom of the page, searching for the signature line. There it was. My name. Calvin. Scripted in a flawless, deceptive imitation of my own handwriting. Derek had executed a massive, complex reverse mortgage and entirely drained my remaining retirement accounts. There were several official transfer authorizations, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my secure savings and directly into a tangled web of unfamiliar corporate holding accounts. And at the bottom of every single authorization page was my forged signature. He had stolen absolutely everything. The money I had bled for over 3 long decades, breathing in toxic smoke, dragging heavy, unyielding hoses through the freezing Chicago winters, missing countless birthdays and holidays with my late wife, was completely gone. As a black man who had to fight for every single inch of ground I ever gained in this country, who endured discrimination and dangerous shifts just to build a tiny sliver of generational wealth, this theft was a spiritual violation. The financial safety net I had built, the emergency funds I had sworn to keep secure for my grandson Leo, had been completely swallowed up by the boundless greed of the man sleeping upstairs. I stared blindly at the forged signatures, feeling a profound, sickening violation wash over my entire body. Derek had not just taken my money. He had stolen the physical manifestation of my entire life's work and sacrifice. He had systematically stripped away my independence, leaving me with absolutely nothing to my name but the modest clothes on my back. It was a calculated, predatory execution of my financial existence. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his crime was breathtaking. He had smiled right in my face every single morning, eaten the warm meals I cooked with my own hands, and treated me like a useless, draining burden, all while he was actively siphoning the very lifeblood from my veins. But the horror of this nightmare did not stop at my own personal ruin. I forced my trembling fingers to turn to the next section of the thick stack, and my heart physically shattered inside my chest. The next set of heavily stapled documents did not have my name on them. They bore the name of my beautiful daughter, Sarah. I leaned in closer, adjusting the beam of my penlight, desperately praying to God that my aging eyes were playing cruel tricks on me in the dark. They were not. I saw the brightly colored logo of a notorious high-risk commercial lending firm. These were massive commercial loan agreements from predatory lenders. The kind of toxic financial instruments that come with exorbitant, crushing interest rates and draconian repayment terms designed to ruin lives. The primary applicant listed on the dense legal document was not Derek. It was Sarah. My brilliant, hard-working daughter who put herself through college and built a pristine credit score through sheer discipline. Her full legal name was printed right there at the very top of the page in stark black ink. Beneath her name was her exact date of birth, and right next to that, chillingly exposed on the fraudulent application, was her personal Social Security number. I stared at those 9 digits in absolute, unadulterated horror. Derek had weaponized his own wife's identity. I flipped rapidly through the attached pages, the dry paper cutting against my fingertips. There was not just one commercial loan. There were 5. 5 massive high-risk loans taken out over the past 8 months, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The glamorous tech startup he constantly bragged about at the dinner table, the company he claimed was making him a modern genius, was nothing but a hollow, fraudulent shell. He was funding his extravagant lifestyle, the custom-tailored suits, the vintage champagne, the diamond-encrusted watch on his wrist, by chaining my daughter to a mountain of inescapable toxic debt. He was secretly taking out these loans using her pristine credit history. If his fake company eventually folded, Derek would simply declare bankruptcy and walk away completely clean. Sarah would be the one left holding the burning bag. The federal government and the aggressive, ruthless collection agencies would come directly after her. They would garnish her wages, seize her assets, and completely destroy any chance she had at providing a stable, secure future for my grandson. She could easily face total bankruptcy or even actual prison time for massive financial fraud she knew absolutely nothing about. Her own husband, the man who swore before God to protect and cherish her, was actively setting her up to be his ultimate sacrificial lamb. A cold, sickening sweat broke out across my forehead, rolling down the deep lines of my face. During my 35 years in the fire department, I had seen desperate arsonists burn down their own failing businesses for insurance money, but this was infinitely more demonic. Derek was actively burning down his own family from the inside out. He was financing his luxurious, arrogant lifestyle by placing a ticking time bomb squarely on the shoulders of the woman he had vowed before a congregation to protect. He was using my child as a human shield to absorb the devastating blast of his own monstrous greed. A suffocating heavy wave of raw grief washed over me, so thick and dark it threatened to crush my lungs. I clearly remembered holding Sarah in my arms the very day she was born, looking down at her tiny face and promising the universe that I would always keep her safe from the cruelty of the world. I remembered walking her down the long church aisle, placing her hand gently into Derek's, trusting with all my soul that this sharp, well-dressed man would honor and cherish her forever. The betrayal I was holding in my hands was so absolute, so fundamentally evil, that it completely defied human comprehension. Derek viewed us not as a loving family, but as disposable raw materials to be consumed and discarded at his convenience. Sarah was just a blind line of credit to him. Leo was just a convenient prop to play the role of the perfect, successful father. and I was just an open, unguarded bank vault waiting to be looted. I had to stop him. I had to tear down his entire deceptive operation and drag him kicking and screaming into the harsh light of justice. But a veteran fire captain knows that you never, ever rush into a blazing, collapsing structure without your protective gear. I needed rock-solid, undeniable proof. I needed to document every single page of this black ledger and every single fraudulent signature before he had the chance to shred the evidence and cover his tracks. My hands were trembling violently as I reached deep into the front pocket of my pajama pants. I pulled out my smartphone, swiping my thumb across the glass to unlock the screen. The bright, sudden glow of the digital display felt blinding in the pitch-black office. I quickly navigated to the camera application, muting the volume so the shutter sound would not echo through the silent house. I laid the reverse mortgage documents and the fraudulent high-risk loan applications completely flat against the dark, patterned carpet. I gripped the cold metal casing of the penlight firmly in my teeth, aiming the narrow beam of light directly onto the forged signatures to make sure the camera focus would be razor-sharp. I hovered the phone lens over the very first page of the ledger. My breathing was heavy and ragged, sounding incredibly loud in the suffocating, heavy silence of the locked room. I tapped the screen, waiting for the digital lens to adjust to the dim lighting conditions. I just needed 5 minutes. 5 uninterrupted minutes to capture enough concrete evidence to take this straight to the federal authorities and put that monster behind iron bars for the rest of his miserable life. I lined up the perfect clear shot of Sarah's forged signature on the largest commercial loan document. My index finger hovered directly over the glowing capture button on the screen. I took one final deep, steadying breath, holding the air in my lungs to keep the camera completely still. And in that exact fraction of a second, the entire room exploded into blinding, harsh white light. The sudden, intense glare hit my dark, adjusted retinas like a severe physical blow. The heavy, expensive crystal chandelier hanging from the center of the office ceiling had been switched on at maximum capacity. The immediate transition from absolute pitch darkness to brilliant, blinding illumination left me completely disoriented. I squinted instinctively, dropping the metal penlight from my mouth and raising my free hand to shield my burning eyes. My heart stopped dead in my chest. The hot adrenaline rushing through my veins instantly turned to solid, freezing ice. I slowly turned my head toward the heavy mahogany door, fighting through the spots dancing in my vision. Standing right there in the open doorway, framed perfectly by the bright light spilling in from the hallway, was Derek. He was wearing his expensive dark silk robe, his hands casually tucked deep into his pockets. He did not look surprised to see me. He did not look angry or violated that I had broken into his private sanctuary. He looked completely and terrifyingly calm. A cold, dead, calculating smile slowly stretched across his face, twisting his handsome features into a mask of pure, absolute malice. He looked down at me, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by his exposed, hidden files, the black ledger, and the cheap, prepaid burner phone. His eyes locked directly onto mine, carrying the chilling emptiness of a predator who had just successfully trapped his prey. That terrifying smile only grew wider, revealing his perfectly white teeth. He tilted his head slightly to the side, watching me hold my phone over his financial crimes. He did not raise his voice or rush toward me. He simply stood there in the blinding light, savoring the exact moment my entire world came crashing down. The harsh, artificial light of the chandelier burned into my retinas, but it was the absolute stillness of the man standing in the doorway that truly froze the blood in my veins. Any normal criminal caught red-handed in the dead of night would have panicked. They would have lunged for the phone or stumbled backward in shock. But Derek did not flinch. He just stood there in his expensive silk robe, his hands casually buried in his pockets, wearing a smile so completely devoid of human empathy that it made my stomach violently turn. He looked at me kneeling on his plush carpet surrounded by the damning evidence of his financial slaughter, and he did not see a threat. He saw a minor inconvenience that he had already anticipated. I slowly lowered my smartphone, my thumb hovering just millimeters away from the capture button. The veteran fire captain inside me, the man who had stared down collapsing roofs and raging infernos on the south side of Chicago, urged me to spring forward and put this arrogant coward through the drywall. My muscles coiled tight, vibrating with a lethal, furious energy. But my mind held me firmly in place. You do not strike an enemy when you are blind to their escape routes. I needed to see exactly what his next move was going to be. Derek stepped smoothly into the office and quietly pushed the heavy mahogany door shut behind him. The soft click of the latch sounded like a prison cell locking into place. He walked around the massive glass desk, his bare feet making absolutely no sound on the carpet. He did not immediately reach for the stolen documents or the black ledger. Instead, he leaned his hip against the edge of the desk, crossed his arms, and let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. "You really thought you were clever, old man," he murmured, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You thought you could just sneak down here in your slippers, play detective, and save the day. You watch too many old movies, Calvin." I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, my arthritic knees popping loudly in the quiet room. I stood to my full height, squaring my broad shoulders, pulling every inch of authority I possessed to tower over his arrogant frame. "You are going to federal prison," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble that did not shake. "I have seen the forged reverse mortgage. I have seen the toxic commercial loans you took out using my daughter's social security number. You are stealing from your own family to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. The authorities are going to tear your fake empire down to the studs." I expected him to defend himself. I expected him to offer a pathetic excuse or try to violently snatch the phone from my grip. But Derek merely shook his head, a look of mock pity washing over his face. He uncrossed his arms and picked up a small silver key from the corner of his desk. He walked over to a lower cabinet that I had not even bothered to pry open. He unlocked it, pulled out a sleek red leather portfolio, and tossed it casually onto the glass desktop. "Go ahead," Derek said, gesturing toward the portfolio with a lazy wave of his hand. "Read it. Since you love digging through private paperwork so much, I think you will find this batch particularly fascinating." I did not want to take my eyes off him, but the sickening confidence in his voice forced my hand. I stepped cautiously toward the desk, keeping my body angled for a fight. I flipped open the red cover and began to read. The very first page hit me with the destructive force of a runaway freight train. It was an email printed on official company letterhead, sent from Sarah's personal account to one of the predatory lenders. The email explicitly authorized the massive transfer of funds into an offshore account. I flipped frantically to the next page. It was a notarized declaration stating that Sarah was the sole managing director of the dummy corporation Derek had been using to funnel the stolen money. Her electronic signatures were everywhere. Her digital fingerprints were meticulously embedded into every single layer of the massive fraud. My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to tremble so violently that the papers rattled against each other. None of this was real. Sarah did not know the first thing about corporate finance or offshore holding companies. She was a dedicated middle school teacher who barely had time to check her personal email between grading papers and raising Leo. "You framed her," I whispered, the horrifying reality crushing the breath right out of my lungs. "You set up your own wife." Derek let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Set her up is such an ugly phrase, Calvin. I prefer to think of it as securing collateral. Did you honestly believe a man in my position would leave himself exposed?" I am building a legacy. I take calculated risks, and I always have an insurance policy." He stepped closer, leaning over the glass desk, so his face was only inches from mine. Every single dime of that high-risk debt is tied directly to Sarah. Every fraudulent wire transfer originated from IP addresses registered to her personal laptop. I have spent the last 8 months carefully crafting a flawless paper trail that proves your sweet, innocent daughter is the criminal mastermind behind this entire operation. The sheer demonic perfection of his plan was paralyzing. He had not just used her as a blind line of credit. He had actively, maliciously built a waterproof cage around her. If the company went under, Sarah would take the fall. If the creditors came knocking, Sarah would be the one dragged into court. "If you take those photos to the police," Derek continued, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper, "let me tell you exactly how tomorrow is going to play out. The federal investigators will raid this house. They will look at the documents you found, and then they will look at the documents I have securely backed up on 5 different encrypted servers. They will see a greedy, manipulative wife who stole her elderly father's retirement funds and defrauded investors to fund her lavish lifestyle. Sarah will be arrested before lunchtime." He paused, letting the unimaginable horror of his words sink deep into my bones. He knew exactly how much I loved my daughter. He knew I would gladly step in front of a speeding bullet to spare her a single ounce of pain. "Federal financial fraud carries a minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years, Calvin," Derek said, leaning back and studying my devastated expression with pure enjoyment. "She will be locked away in a federal penitentiary surrounded by the absolute worst of society. She will lose her teaching license. She will lose her reputation. She will lose her entire life." I felt a physical sickness rising in my stomach, a vile, churning nausea that threatened to double me over. But the monster standing in front of me was not finished. He saved the absolute worst, devastating blow for last. "And while your daughter is sitting in a concrete cell," Derek said, his voice turning impossibly colder, "I will be standing before a family court judge. I will play the role of the heartbroken, betrayed husband. I will retain full and undisputed legal custody of Leo. He will grow up in this house alone with me. You will be a penniless, homeless old man with no legal rights to see him ever again. And I will make sure Leo learns to completely despise the mother who abandoned him and the grandfather who put her behind bars. The image of my sweet, energetic grandson Leo, the boy who held my hand on the way to the school bus, the boy who wanted to be a brave firefighter, trapped in this massive empty house with a sociopath, was too much to bear. My vision literally went red. The roaring inferno of a protective father and grandfather broke completely off its chain. I lunged across the desk, grabbing Derek by the lapels of his expensive silk robe. I slammed him backward against the heavy legal bookshelves. A thick, hardcover book tumbled to the floor with a loud thud. I pressed my forearm directly against his throat, pinning him securely against the wood. My face was inches from his, my teeth bared like a wild animal. "I will kill you." I snarled the words tearing from my throat with a savage, primal intensity. "I will break you in half before I let you destroy my family." Derek did not fight back. He did not struggle against my grip. He just stared up at me, his breath hitching slightly against the pressure on his windpipe. But that sick, mocking smile never left his eyes. "Go ahead." He choked out a raspy laugh vibrating in his throat. "Do it, Calvin. Assault me in my own home. That will just get you arrested tonight and leave Sarah completely defenseless by morning. You are entirely powerless, old man. You have absolutely no moves left on the board." The agonizing truth of his words hit me like a bucket of freezing water. He was right. If I hurt him now, I would be thrown into a police cruiser and Sarah would be left completely alone with this predator. I was trapped in a flawless, impenetrable corner. I slowly released my grip, lowering my arm. My chest heaved with ragged, heavy breaths as I stepped backward away from the desk. Derek straightened his robe, smoothing the wrinkled silk with deliberate, arrogant slowness. He reached into the deep pocket of his robe and pulled out a glossy trifold pamphlet. He tossed it casually through the air. It fluttered down and landed right at my feet. I looked down. The brightly colored text on the cover read, "Shady Pines Assisted Living Facility." It was a notoriously run-down, underfunded state facility on the absolute worst side of the city, a place where forgotten people were sent to waste away in miserable neglect. "You have overstayed your welcome in my house," Derek stated, his voice returning to that crisp, authoritative business tone. "You are going to pack your bags right now. You are going to leave this property before the sun comes up. You will not say goodbye to Sarah. You will not say goodbye to Leo. If you ever try to contact them again, if you ever breathe a single word of what you saw in this office, I will initiate the protocol and send your daughter straight to a federal prison block." I stood frozen in the center of the dark office, staring at the terrible brochure lying on the carpet. He had orchestrated the absolute perfect execution. He had stripped me of my home, my life savings, my dignity, and now he was severing my heart from my chest. I looked up at the man who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. He turned his back to me, walking calmly toward the door, leaving me alone with the shattered remains of my life. I bent down and picked up the glossy pamphlet, my large, calloused hands shaking with a new terrifying resolve. I was walking out of that house tonight just as he demanded. But what Derek failed to understand was that you never back a seasoned fire captain into a corner. Because when the flames cut off every visible exit, you do not simply lay down and die. You grab your heavy axe and you smash a brand new door straight through the solid brick wall. I was leaving tonight, but I was coming back to burn his fraudulent empire completely to the ground. If you are feeling the fire in this father's heart, please hit that like button to support my fight for justice. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the moment I take this monster down. Drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one, and it gives me strength to know folks all around the world are standing with me. Stay blessed and stay vigilant. The pale gray light of early dawn crept through the slatted blinds of my tiny guest room, washing over the bare walls like dirty dishwater. I had not slept a single wink. I spent the remaining hours of the night sitting rigidly on the very edge of my mattress, my heavy work boots laced up tight, staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor. My mind was a chaotic, swirling vortex of absolute horror and calculated strategy. The sheer magnitude of Derek's demonic financial crimes weighed on my chest like a physical block of solid concrete. I waited in the suffocating silence of the massive house, listening intently to the morning routine of the monster who had hijacked my family. I heard the muffled rush of the master bathroom shower, the rhythmic thud of his expensive leather dress shoes pacing the hallway, and finally, the low, heavy rumble of his luxury vehicle pulling out of the long, circular driveway. Once I was absolutely certain Derek was safely tucked away in his downtown office dealing with his fake tech startup, I let out a ragged, breathless sigh. This was my one and only window. I had to speak to my daughter. I found Sarah standing perfectly still in the center of the sprawling, pristine kitchen. She was clutching a warm ceramic mug of coffee in both of her trembling hands, staring blankly out the large bay window into the manicured backyard. Looking at her standing there in the morning light, my heart fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces all over again. The vibrant, fiercely independent black woman I had proudly raised, the young girl who used to march in loud college protests and passionately debate civil rights at our Sunday dinner table, was completely gone. In her place stood a hollow, exhausted shell of a human being. She looked physically drained, her beautiful brown skin lacking its usual warm glow, her shoulders permanently hunched, as if she were carrying the invisible, crushing weight of the entire world. I approached her slowly, deliberately scuffing my rubber-soled slippers against the tile floor so I would not startle her. I reached out and gently placed my rough, calloused hand over her trembling fingers. She jumped slightly, her wide brown eyes snapping toward me, filled with an automatic defensive apprehension. "Sarah, baby, we need to talk," I whispered, keeping my voice as incredibly calm and steady as I possibly could. I used the exact same low, soothing tone I used to employ when talking down a panicked citizen trapped on a narrow window ledge. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You and Leo are in severe immediate danger, and we need to pack your things and leave this house today." I watched deep confusion ripple across her tired face. I did not hold anything back. I took a deep breath and poured out the entire horrifying truth. I told her about my midnight breach into Derek's locked home office. I told her about prying open the steel filing cabinet and finding the forged federal paperwork proving he had secretly sold the vintage vehicle I had legally promised to my grandson. I told her about the reverse mortgage that had entirely drained my remaining retirement accounts. But most importantly, I told her about the black leather ledger. I explained in desperate, urgent detail about the massive high-risk commercial loans taken out under her specific name. I told her that Derek was maliciously using her personal identity to build a fraudulent corporate empire, positioning her to take the ultimate catastrophic legal fall when his massive house of cards inevitably collapsed. I fully expected her to gasp in absolute shock. I expected the fierce protective mother inside her to rise up in furious righteous indignation. I expected her to slam her coffee mug onto the Marble Island, grab Leo by the hand, and sprint toward the front door. Instead, she slowly pulled her hand away from mine. She looked at me not with awakening outrage, but with deep, profound, pitying sorrow. A fresh, heavy wave of tears welled up in her exhausted eyes, spilling rapidly over her cheeks. "Oh, Dad." She choked out, her voice trembling with a devastating mix of sheer exhaustion and misplaced sympathy. Derek warned me this might happen. Those 7 words hit me like a physical, crushing blow to the jaw. I actually stumbled backward, a half step completely thrown off my center of gravity. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice cracking with sudden confusion. "What did he warn you about?" She wrapped her arms tightly around her own waist, physically shrinking into herself. "He told me you were struggling deeply. He said that losing the old family house and losing Mom so quickly, it was all becoming just way too much for your aging mind to process. He sat me down last week and told me you were starting to imagine terrible things, Dad. He said you were creating invisible enemies out of thin air, just to make sense of your overwhelming grief and your loss of financial independence." I stared at my own flesh and blood in absolute unadulterated horror. The sheer demonic brilliance of his manipulation physically paralyzed me. Derek had not just trapped her financially with fraudulent loans. He had completely and methodically hijacked her entire reality. He had planted these insidious, poisonous seeds of doubt in her mind long before I ever stepped foot into his locked office. He had meticulously laid the psychological groundwork, painting me as a senile, grieving old man rapidly losing his grip on sanity. He did this specifically so that if I ever actually discovered his vile crimes, my desperate warnings would sound exactly like the paranoid, delusional ramblings of a man suffering from dementia. "Sarah, you have to listen to me. I am not losing my mind," I pleaded, my voice rising in desperate, frantic urgency. "I saw the official paperwork with my own 2 eyes. He practiced and forged your signature. He is setting you up to go to federal prison." She shook her head vigorously, squeezing her eyes tightly shut, as if my true words were physically burning her. "Stop it, Dad, please, just stop it," she cried, her voice breaking into a loud, desperate sob. "Derek is working so incredibly hard to provide a beautiful life for us. He graciously took you in when you had absolutely nowhere else to go and no money left to your name. Why are you constantly trying to ruin our family? He told me you might get aggressive and combative. He told me your memory was slipping and that you would try to blame him for your own terrible financial mistakes. You need help, Dad." The crushing, agonizing truth washed over me like a freezing tidal wave. Derek had gaslit my beautiful daughter so thoroughly and so effectively that she was now actively, fiercely defending the very predator who was leading her directly to the slaughterhouse. He had systematically stripped away her self-esteem, isolated her from her independent friends, and aggressively rewired her brain to rely entirely on his fabricated version of the universe. If I pushed her any harder, if I grabbed her by the shoulders and forcefully demanded she believe my story, I would only be fulfilling the exact crazy, combative narrative Derek had already written for me. I would push her further into his waiting toxic arms. And infinitely worse, if I tried to force the issue and drag her out of the house, Derek would immediately initiate his ultimate threat. He would hand over his meticulously forged digital evidence to the federal authorities, and Sarah would be dragged out of this pristine kitchen in cold steel handcuffs. A seasoned fire captain knows that you cannot extinguish a violent chemical grease fire by throwing a bucket of water on it. You will only spread the devastating, lethal flames across the entire room. Sometimes, to truly save the burning structure, you have to temporarily retreat. You have to swallow your fear, starve the roaring fire of oxygen, and aggressively attack it from a completely blind, unseen angle. I looked deeply into my daughter's weeping, terrified eyes, and I made the absolute most agonizing, soul-crushing decision of my entire life. I had to swallow my pride. I had to let the monster win the morning so I could ultimately win the war. I deliberately let my broad, heavy shoulders slump, physically collapsing my strong posture. I allowed my facial muscles to slacken into an expression of profound, confused defeat. I reached up and slowly rubbed my temples with shaking hands, perfectly playing the exact pathetic role Derek had scripted for me. Maybe I stammered, letting my voice crack with manufactured fragile weakness. "Maybe you are right, baby girl. Maybe I am just so incredibly tired. My head has been so foggy and confused lately. The grief, it just plays such cruel tricks on an old man." Sarah let out a heavy, shuddering breath, stepping forward to wrap her arms tightly around my neck. "It is going to be okay, Daddy," she whispered, crying softly into my collar. "It is all going to be okay. Derek is already looking into some really nice specialized care facilities for you. Places that can safely help with your memory issues. He just wants what is absolutely best for you." My stomach violently revolted at those sickening words, but I forced myself to hug her back gently, kissing the top of her head. I told her that I loved her more than life itself. I told her I would go upstairs and quietly pack my things, because I did not want to be a confusing burden on her beautiful family for one single second longer. I walked heavily up the winding grand staircase, dragging my boots against the carpet to complete the tragic illusion of a broken, defeated spirit. I entered my tiny room and pulled my old, battered canvas duffel bag from the closet. I did not pack much, just a few pairs of sturdy denim jeans, my comfortable flannel shirts, my worn-out leather work boots, and the framed photograph of my late wife. I zipped the heavy canvas bag shut, the harsh metallic sound echoing the painful finality of the moment. Before I walked out the front door, I stopped silently by Leo's bedroom. My sweet, brilliant grandson was sitting cross-legged on his colorful rug, playing quietly with his plastic toy fire trucks. I knelt down beside him, my old joints popping loudly. I pulled his small, warm body into a fierce, desperate embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of his morning shampoo. "Grandpa has to go away for a little while, buddy," I whispered, fighting back the very real burning tears stinging the corners of my eyes. "But I want you to remember something incredibly important for me. Remember the golden rule of the firehouse." Leo looked up at me with his big, soulful brown eyes, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "Always check the doors for heat," he recited softly. "That is exactly right," I said, tapping my large finger gently against his chest, right over his beating heart. "You stay smart. You stay watchful. And you always know that Grandpa loves you, and I will absolutely always come back to get you." I stood up, hoisted the heavy canvas duffel bag over my shoulder, and walked slowly down the stairs. Sarah watched me from the kitchen archway, her face a tragic portrait of heartbreaking sorrow. I gave her one last, slow, submissive nod, a masterclass performance of total, absolute surrender. Then I turned the brass knob of the heavy front door and walked out into the crisp, biting morning air. The heavy, solid oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing my entire family inside the pristine fortress of a calculated psychopath. I walked down the long, paved driveway, my boots hitting the concrete with a slow, rhythmic thud. Derek genuinely thought he had completely neutralized the threat. He thought he had successfully discarded a helpless, senile old fool. He thought I was quietly shuffling off to some miserable state-funded nursing home to wither away and die in absolute silence. But as soon as I stepped past the tall iron security gates and moved completely out of sight of the mansion's perimeter surveillance cameras, my posture instantly snapped straight. The feigned, pathetic frailty completely evaporated from my aging bones, replaced by a cold, lethal, and absolute resolve. I was not a broken, confused old man. I was a veteran commander of the Chicago Fire Department, and I was about to ignite a massive destructive inferno under Derek's fraudulent empire that absolutely no amount of water would ever be able to extinguish. If you are feeling the fierce protective fire in this father's heart, please hit that like button to support my fight for total justice. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the exact moment I finally take this arrogant monster down. Drop a quick comment below telling me what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one, and it gives me incredible strength to know good folks all around the world are standing firmly with me. Stay blessed and stay vigilant. I traded the pristine quiet of that multi-million-dollar estate for the rattling mechanical hum of a broken air conditioning unit. The room I rented was at a forgotten motel sitting right on the dusty edge of the county line, where the low rumble of highway traffic never actually stops. The floral wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the air held a permanent stale dampness that settled deep into my aging joints. Derek honestly believed this was my final destination. He assumed that stripping me of my finances and threatening my daughter with federal prison would permanently break my spirit. He thought I was just going to lay down on that lumpy mattress, pull the thin, scratchy blanket over my head, and wait quietly for the Grim Reaper to take me away. He expected me to be a good, compliant victim and fade into the miserable shadows. But my son-in-law severely underestimated the resilience of a man who spent his entire adult life running headfirst into burning buildings. The roaring inferno of anger that had consumed me the night before did not extinguish when I walked out of his front door. It simply changed states. The hot, chaotic flames crystallized. My blinding rage turned into absolute freezing ice. I sat at the small, wobbly laminate table in the corner of that dingy room, staring out the smudged window at the flickering neon vacancy sign buzzing against the morning sky. I was not a helpless victim. I was a veteran commander, and a seasoned commander knows that when you find yourself completely outgunned and outmaneuvered behind enemy lines, you do not fight blindly. You fall back, secure your position, and you call in the heavy artillery. I reached into my canvas duffel bag and pulled out my smartphone. I scrolled past the familiar names of old friends from the firehouse and the guys from my old Southside neighborhood. This specific situation required a highly specialized set of skills that raw muscle and brute force could never provide. I stopped my thumb on a name I had not dialed since my beloved wife passed away. Mitchell. He was my late wife Elena's older brother. Mitchell and I were about as physically and culturally different as two men could possibly be. I was a broad-shouldered black man who made his living wrestling heavy hoses and swinging steel axes through burning wood. Mitchell was a slender, sharp-featured white American who wore crisp, tailored suits and practically lived his entire life behind a mahogany desk. But we were fiercely united by an unbreakable, profound bond. We both loved Elena with our entire souls, and we both adored my daughter Sarah. More importantly, Mitchell possessed the exact weapon I desperately needed to dismantle Derek's fraudulent empire. My brother-in-law was a recently retired forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service. He had spent 4 long decades tracking down elusive tax evaders, dismantling complex corporate fraud rings, and putting wealthy, arrogant white-collar criminals behind federal bars. He was a relentless human bloodhound with numbers. I pressed the green call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang only twice before his crisp, no-nonsense voice answered the line. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I was in serious trouble and that his niece Sarah was in immediate, terrifying danger. Mitchell did not ask a single unnecessary question. He simply demanded my current location. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in a cracked red vinyl booth at a rundown 24-hour diner just a few miles down the highway from my damp motel. I ordered a black coffee and waited, listening to the clatter of silverware and the low murmur of tired truck drivers. Mitchell walked through the greasy glass doors exactly on time. He wore a sharp beige trench coat over a neat blue button-down shirt, his silver hair perfectly parted. He slid into the booth across from me, his piercing blue eyes immediately scanning my exhausted face. He ordered a plain black tea from the waitress and waited in absolute silence until she walked away, before leaning across the sticky Formica table. "Tell me everything," Calvin Mitchell said, his voice low and remarkably steady. I pulled my phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. I opened the digital photo gallery and slid the device across the table. I watched Mitchell's seasoned professional eyes narrow as he began swiping through the high-resolution images I had captured in Derek's dark home office. I explained the entire living nightmare from the very beginning. I told him how Derek had systematically manipulated Sarah into believing I was rapidly losing my mind to dementia. I described the forged bill of sale for the vintage Mustang I had painstakingly restored for my grandson Leo. I watched Mitchell's jaw tighten, a muscle feathering in his cheek, as I explained the deceptive reverse mortgage that completely drained the last drop of my life savings. But when he reached the photographs of the massive commercial loan applications, the ones bearing Sarah's explicitly forged signature and her highly confidential social security number, Mitchell completely stopped moving. The normal, healthy color drained from his face, replaced instantly by a tight flush of absolute pure fury. He placed the phone gently on the table and let out a long, slow breath through his nose. The silence between us grew heavy and violently electric. Mitchell was a man who had seen every conceivable flavor of human greed during his long tenure at the IRS. He had audited ruthless billionaires and investigated offshore mafia shell companies without breaking a sweat. But this was deeply, terribly personal. This was his niece. This was his late sister's little girl. That arrogant, smug son of a bitch is actively using her as a human shield, Mitchell whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, quiet intensity. He is deliberately structuring a massive default event, Calvin. When those toxic, high-risk loans inevitably collapse, the aggressive creditors will bypass him completely and go straight for her throat. They will take her home her teacher's pension and heavily push for severe federal fraud charges. He is setting Sarah up to take the ultimate catastrophic fall for his entire fake corporate empire. I nodded my chest, aching with the fresh, agonizing validation of my worst fears. He told me that if I go to the local police, he will hand over his fabricated digital trail and have her arrested by noon, I said, my voice thick with lingering dread. He threatened to take full, undisputed custody of Leo and leave me with absolutely nothing. Mitchell picked up his tea, took one single deliberate sip, and set the cup down with a sharp, metallic clack. Derek thinks he is playing a simple game of chess with a grieving old man, Mitchell stated, his eyes locking onto mine with the cold, supreme calculation of an apex predator. He does not realize he just invited the full weight of the federal government into his living room. I know exactly how these fraudulent shell companies operate. I know every single dirty trick, every hidden routing number, and every offshore loophole these cowards try to use to hide their stolen cash. We immediately left the diner and drove straight back to my cheap motel room. The peeling wallpaper and the flickering neon light outside no longer mattered in the slightest. That miserable little room instantly transformed into a highly focused two-man tactical command center. Mitchell opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a high-powered secure laptop, a thick stack of yellow legal pads, and 3 different encrypted flash drives. We pushed the wobbly laminate table directly to the center of the room and spread out every single piece of photographic evidence I had gathered. I narrated the precise physical layout of Derek's home office, detailing the exact location shot of the steel filing cabinet, the cheap burner phone, and the black leather ledger. Mitchell's fingers flew rapidly across his keyboard, typing furiously as he began running preliminary deep web traces on the holding companies listed in the loan documents. We worked straight through the afternoon and deep into the early hours of the next morning. While I supplied the intimate personal details of Derek's daily routine and his arrogant, careless slip-ups at the dinner table, Mitchell weaponized that raw information. He cross-referenced the names of the venture capitalists who had attended the dinner party, searching tirelessly for any hidden connections to the fraudulent loan originators. The retired IRS agent was an absolute relentless machine. He was pulling public tax records, digging deep into corporate registries, and meticulously mapping out the complex, tangled web of Derek's financial deceit on the yellow notepads. I watched my brother-in-law work with a deep, profound sense of gratitude and surging hope. Derek had tried so hard to isolate me. He had actively tried to make me feel completely alone and utterly powerless in his massive, pristine fortress. He thought a retired working-class black man from the South Side was no match for his slick, modern corporate intellect. But Derek made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He forgot that working-class men build families based on fierce loyalty and shared sacrifice, not on bank balances and stock options. He forgot that the bond between a protective uncle and his niece is sacred territory. As the morning sun finally broke through the dirty motel window, casting a pale golden light over our makeshift war room, Mitchell looked up from his glowing laptop screen. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his tired, bloodshot eyes, but a sharp, hungry smile touched the corners of his mouth. "We have the thread," Calvin Mitchell said, tapping a thick finger against the yellow legal pad filled with connecting lines and routing numbers. He honestly thinks he buried his tracks, but his massive ego made him incredibly sloppy. He left a digital footprint wide enough to drive a hook and ladder fire truck through. We are not just going to prove Sarah is completely innocent. We are going to entirely obliterate his financial existence and ensure he spends the rest of his natural life wearing a federal jumpsuit. I looked at the complicated charts and graphs spreading across the table, and I felt the icy resolve in my chest harden into pure, unbreakable steel. The strategic rescue operation had officially begun, and we were going to bring the whole fraudulent structure down right on top of his arrogant head. The harsh fluorescent bulb buzzing above the peeling motel mirror cast a sickly yellow glow over our makeshift war room. Outside the thin window, the rumble of 18-wheelers grinding down the interstate served as a constant, heavy soundtrack to the longest morning of my life. Mitchell sat hunched over his high-powered laptop at the rickety laminate table. His reading glasses were perched low on the bridge of his nose. For 3 solid hours, the only sounds inside that damp room were the frantic clacking of his keyboard and his occasional sharp intake of breath. I paced the worn carpet holding a lukewarm cup of bitter black coffee. The physical exhaustion of being awake for over 24 hours was completely eclipsed by the massive adrenaline surge pumping through my veins. I had provided Mitchell with the high-resolution photographs of Derek's hidden ledger, but I had also burned those specific bank routing numbers directly into my memory. A man who spends 35 years memorizing complex building schematics and hazardous material codes does not easily forget a string of digits that represent his stolen livelihood. I rattled off the sequence of account numbers while Mitchell ran them through sophisticated tracing software he had acquired during his long decorated tenure with the Internal Revenue Service. He was a master of his craft. He bypassed superficial corporate firewalls and dug straight down into the muddy digital bedrock where the real money moved. "Calvin, you need to come look at this," Mitchell finally said. His voice was completely devoid of its usual calm professional detachment. It was tight and heavy with a creeping sense of absolute dread. I set my coffee cup down on the wobbly nightstand and stepped up right behind his chair. I stared at the cascading lines of financial data scrolling rapidly across his bright screen. To my untrained eyes, it was just a chaotic waterfall of foreign currency symbols and banking acronyms. But to Mitchell, it was a perfectly clear, terrifying map of pure devastation. "That brilliant tech startup Derek is always bragging about," Mitchell began pointing a thick finger at a cluster of red numbers on the monitor. "The one he claims is revolutionizing the industry and pulling in massive venture capital. It is a complete and total phantom, Calvin. There is absolutely no product. There is no innovative software. There is no legitimate revenue stream whatsoever." I leaned in closer, trying to process the magnitude of his words. "What exactly are you saying, Mitchell?" "I am saying your son-in-law is running a textbook Ponzi scheme," Mitchell replied, turning his chair to look me squarely in the eye. "A massive, highly illegal house of cards. Those arrogant, wealthy men you cooked dinner for last night are not investing in a product. They are just feeding the beast. Derek takes the fresh cash from the new investors to pay fake dividend returns to the older investors, creating the illusion of a wildly successful, highly profitable company. But the core of the operation is entirely hollow. It is a financial black hole." A cold, sickening wave of realization washed over me. The lavish dinners, the custom-tailored suits, the diamond-encrusted Rolex watch that my grandson Leo had pointed out. None of it was earned. All of it was a carefully constructed theatrical performance designed to lure greedy rich men into handing over their fortunes. But the horror did not stop at his wealthy associates. Mitchell turned back to his keyboard, his jaw locked tight. He typed in a new command, bringing up a completely different set of digital documents. "Here is where it gets truly demonic, Calvin. A Ponzi scheme of this size requires constant, massive infusions of cash just to stay afloat. When Derek could not secure enough new investors to cover his tracks, he started cannibalizing his own family. He used the reverse mortgage on your retirement funds and the fraudulent high-risk commercial loans taken out in Sarah's name to artificially inflate the company ledgers. He brought up a complex web of transactions. I watched in sheer physical agony as the screen displayed the exact trajectory of my stolen life savings. The money I had bled for the pension I had earned pulling innocent people from burning buildings had been quickly washed through 3 different domestic shell companies. From there, it was electronically wired directly into an offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. Sarah's fraudulent loans met the exact same fate. Millions of dollars legally chained directly to my beautiful daughter were actively being laundered out of the United States banking system and deposited securely into untraceable offshore tax havens. He is moving the capital completely out of federal jurisdiction, Mitchell explained, his voice dropping to a harsh, bitter whisper. He knows the federal authorities are going to catch wind of the missing investor funds eventually. He is methodically draining every single usable asset, drying up the domestic accounts, and staging the stolen money overseas, where the authorities cannot easily freeze it. I gripped the back of Mitchell's chair so tightly, the plastic cracked under my heavy hands. He is building a massive escape pod. I realized the terrible truth crystallizing in my mind. He is going to completely vanish and leave Sarah standing directly in the blast zone. Mitchell nodded grimly, his blue eyes filled with a fierce, protective fury. But a man does not steal millions of dollars and plan a highly complex international escape just to sit on a beach alone. He clicked on a secondary folder, opening a series of intercepted electronic communications. I dug into the primary ownership structure of that holding company in the Cayman Islands. Derek is listed as the primary beneficiary. But there is a secondary partner on the account. He opened a digital profile, bringing up a high-definition photograph. It was a woman. She was young, striking, and styled in expensive designer clothing. Her name was Victoria. According to the public registry, she was listed as one of the primary angel investors for Derek's tech startup. But the private emails Mitchell had pulled from the hidden server painted an entirely different, sickening picture. I read the messages displayed on the screen. They were not corporate correspondence. They were deeply intimate, explicit, and highly detailed conversations between Derek and this woman. They were actively discussing the construction of a private luxury villa overlooking the ocean. They were finalizing the purchase of an expensive private yacht. She was not just a wealthy investor. She was his mistress. She was his partner in this massive criminal conspiracy. My blood ran completely cold. The betrayal was so deep, so multi-layered, that it defied all human logic. Derek had not just stopped loving my daughter. He had actively plotted to destroy her while carrying on a luxurious hidden life with another woman. He would come home, kiss his wife, pat my grandson on the head, and sit at the dinner table playing the role of the devoted family man. And then he would walk into his locked office and coordinate the systematic financial slaughter of the woman he had sworn to protect, all to fund a permanent tropical vacation with his wealthy mistress. "Look at the dates on these flight itineraries," Calvin Mitchell said, pulling up a final devastating document. I leaned down, reading the bold print on the airline confirmation. Derek and Victoria had booked 2 one-way first-class tickets to an international jurisdiction that did not possess a formal extradition treaty with the United States. The departure date was exactly 2 weeks from today. The ticking clock in my head suddenly transformed into a blaring, deafening alarm. 2 weeks. In exactly 14 days, Derek would board a luxury flight and completely disappear from the face of the earth. He would leave behind a hollowed-out, fraudulent company. The furious venture capitalists would immediately demand their money back. The predatory commercial lenders would aggressively execute their legal rights on the massive defaulted loans. And because Derek had meticulously forged Sarah's digital signature on every single toxic document, the federal government and the furious creditors would target her with the full devastating force of the law. My daughter would be violently dragged out of her home. She would face aggressive prosecution for a multi-million-dollar federal fraud she knew absolutely nothing about. She would lose her teaching license, her freedom, and any chance of providing a safe, loving home for Leo. Derek was planning to drop a nuclear bomb on his own family and walk away perfectly clean. I stepped back from the table, pacing the short length of the dingy motel room. The stale, damp air suddenly felt impossible to breathe. The massive scale of the evil we had just uncovered was threatening to suffocate me. I thought about Sarah crying in the kitchen, completely brainwashed by his cruel psychological manipulation. I thought about my grandson Leo whispering those 3 brave words at the dinner table, knowing inherently that his father was a monster, even if he did not understand the full scope of the danger. I stopped pacing and looked directly at Mitchell. My brother-in-law was already watching me, his hands resting quietly on his laptop keyboard. We did not need to exchange a multitude of words. We both loved the same people. We both understood exactly what was at stake. The time for gathering simple evidence was officially over. The time for defensive strategy had completely expired. We were standing on the absolute edge of a massive cliff, and the only way to save my daughter was to aggressively push Derek over the side before he could make his final move. "We have exactly 14 days, Mitchell said, breaking the heavy silence. "If he gets on that plane, Sarah goes to federal prison, and you will never see your grandson again. The local police will not understand a financial crime of this magnitude in time to stop him. If we alert them now, Derek will simply deploy his highly paid legal team, tie the investigation up in red tape, and easily catch an earlier flight." I squared my broad shoulders, the veteran fire captain, fully taking the reins. I had fought raging chemical fires that consumed entire city blocks. I had pulled helpless people from the jaws of absolute certain death. I was not about to let a smooth-talking, arrogant con artist destroy my bloodline. "We do not go to the local police," I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble that echoed in the small room. "We do not give him the chance to hide behind his expensive lawyers. We are going to strip him of his armor. We are going to lock every single door, burn his fraudulent empire straight to the ground, and make sure he is the one trapped inside when the roof collapses." Mitchell nodded, a cold, fierce smile spreading across his face. He cracked his knuckles and turned his attention back to the glowing laptop screen, ready to initiate the total destruction of Derek's life. The war room was officially hot, and we were going to bring the absolute wrath of God down upon his head. 14 days. That single terrifying number was an invisible ticking clock hanging directly over my head. Mitchell and I sat in that damp, miserable motel room, staring at the yellow legal pads covering the wobbly table. We knew the paper trail we had uncovered was absolutely damning, but we also knew how the federal justice system operated. Paper can be debated. Paper can be manipulated by high-priced, slick defense attorneys. Derek could easily stand before a judge and claim his startup simply failed due to market conditions. He could claim the offshore accounts were legitimate business reserves created on the advice of a bad consultant. He could actively argue that Sarah was the managing director and completely blame her for the toxic loans. To get the Federal Bureau of Investigation to kick his pristine front door down before he boarded that first-class flight to a country with no extradition treaty, we needed the ultimate golden ticket. We needed his own arrogant voice. We needed undeniable, crystal-clear audio and visual proof of his malicious intent to frame my daughter and flee the country with his wealthy mistress. Mitchell used his old federal tax enforcement contacts to acquire some highly specialized surveillance equipment. My brother-in-law was a man who knew how to operate in the shadows when the law required a little physical encouragement. He handed me 3 microscopic audio transmitters and 2 high-definition pinhole cameras. They were incredibly small devices, cleverly disguised as ordinary household items like generic wall chargers and tiny magnetic clips. But having the gear was only the very first step. We had to plant them perfectly inside a highly secure, multi-million-dollar fortress. Derek had already changed the primary locks and updated the digital security codes the very same morning. He handed me that brochure for the rundown nursing home and kicked me out into the street. He thought he had completely sealed his castle, but he forgot that I spent over 3 decades as a fire captain in the heart of Chicago. I did not just put out fires. I spent my entire adult life learning exactly how to breach reinforced structures, dissecting building layouts, and finding the absolute fastest way through locked doors to save trapped citizens. I spent the next 48 hours sitting in my rented inconspicuous sedan parked several blocks down the street from their gated community. I conducted pure, old-fashioned surveillance tracking their daily movements with the disciplined, icy patience of a man hunting a dangerous predator. I watched my own family from a distance, feeling a heavy, agonizing ache in my chest every time I saw Sarah drive past. She looked so tired gripping the steering wheel of her car, with white knuckles, completely unaware of the financial guillotine hanging directly over her head. I knew her weekly schedule perfectly. Sarah always had her mandatory faculty meetings at the middle school on Tuesday afternoons, and she always picked up Leo from his after-school program right around 4 o'clock. Derek was the unpredictable wild card. But my luck finally turned on a humid Wednesday morning. I watched his gleaming luxury sedan pull out of the long, circular driveway, heading straight for his downtown office so he could play the role of the brilliant tech visionary for another day. 10 minutes later, Sarah pulled out to head to her school. The massive house was completely empty. This was my one and only window. I grabbed the small black canvas bag holding the surveillance gear and stepped out into the warm morning air. Approaching that sprawling modern mansion felt entirely different this time. I was no longer the discarded, useless father-in-law walking with a heavy, defeated shuffle. I was a tactical operative moving deep behind enemy lines with a singular, righteous mission. I bypassed the main front door, knowing Derek had a high-definition doorbell camera watching the porch. I moved swiftly and silently along the side of the house, slipping through the tall, manicured privacy hedges that lined the property. I reached the side utility entrance near the laundry room. People who rely heavily on expensive electronic security systems always forget the simple physical weak points of a structure. They lock the front door, but ignore the service entrances. I pulled a thin piece of tempered steel from my jacket pocket. It was a specialized breaching tool I had carried for years. I slid the flat metal down into the narrow gap between the heavy door and the frame, applying a precise, calculated pressure right against the internal latch. I leaned my shoulder into the wood, feeling for the subtle mechanical shift. The lock gave way with a soft, satisfying click. I pushed the door open, slipping my broad frame inside and quietly closed it behind me. The house was eerily silent. It smelled intensely of expensive floral diffusers and cold, empty space. The grand hallway stretched out before me, feeling more like a museum than a warm family home. I moved silently across the imported hardwood floors, placing my rubber-soled boots carefully to avoid any creaking floorboards. I made a direct line for the back of the ground floor, straight toward his private home office. I picked the lock on his heavy mahogany door in less than 30 seconds. Stepping back into that dark room brought a fresh, massive wave of blinding anger. This was the exact spot where he had smiled that dead cold smile and threatened to destroy my daughter. But I forced the hot rage down, replacing it with freezing tactical ice. I moved straight to his massive glass desk. I pulled the first audio bug from my canvas bag. It was a sophisticated device no larger than a standard shirt button, holding a battery that would last for weeks. I peeled off the adhesive backing and attached it firmly to the underside of the thick desk directly beneath where Derek usually sat to make his private calls. I pressed it hard against the metal frame, ensuring it would not budge. Next, I pulled out one of the pinhole cameras. It was built perfectly into a generic black phone charger plug. I found an open electrical outlet on the wall directly facing his luxurious leather chair. I plugged it in, checking the tiny indicator light. It looked exactly like a forgotten piece of electronics left behind to charge a device. Every arrogant phone call he made to his mistress, every cruel financial scheme he laughed about, and every detail of his escape plan would now be captured in pristine high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I stood up and surveyed the room, making absolutely certain I had not disturbed the dust on his desk or moved any of his perfectly arranged files. But my mission was not entirely finished. I slipped back out of the office and moved quietly down the hallway into the attached multi-car garage. Derek had taken his primary sedan to the city, but his secondary luxury sports car, a ridiculous imported machine he only drove on the weekends, was parked in the center bay. I knew from my previous 6 months of living in this house, doing his chores and cleaning his messes, that he always kept a spare electronic key fob hidden inside the metal utility cabinet on the far wall. I opened the cabinet, moving past the cans of premium car wax and expensive tools until my fingers brushed against the smooth plastic fob. I pressed the unlock button. The sports car chirped softly, its sleek lights flashing once in the dim garage. I opened the heavy driver's side door and slid into the low seat. The overwhelming smell of rich imported leather hit my nose instantly, reminding me of the vintage Mustang he had stolen from my grandson. I swallowed the bitterness and reached deep under the dashboard, feeling around the cluster of complex wiring harnesses near the steering column. I took the second audio transmitter and wedged it tightly into a narrow gap, securing it perfectly out of sight with a small zip tie. Derek conducted half of his shady business while driving, treating his cars like mobile command centers. Now we would hear every single word he spoke while navigating the Atlanta traffic. I stepped out of the car, locking the doors and carefully placing the spare key fob exactly where I had found it. I pulled a small microfiber cloth from my bag and meticulously wiped down every single surface I had touched. I cleaned the door handles, the utility cabinet, and the glass desk in his office, ensuring I left absolutely zero trace of my physical presence. A ghost leaves no fingerprints. I walked back towards the laundry room exit, my heart hammering a steady rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I paused for a brief second, looking up the grand staircase toward the second floor. I thought about Leo's dinosaur pajamas and the small plastic fire trucks scattered across his bedroom rug. I thought about Sarah's tired, beautiful face. I was doing this for them. I was breaking the law to save their lives. I slipped out the side service door, pulling it firmly shut until the latch clicked securely back into place. I melted back into the shadows of the tall privacy hedges and walked briskly down the street toward my waiting sedan. When I finally made it back to the damp motel room, Mitchell was sitting at the laminate table with his headphones on. He looked up as I walked through the door, a fierce, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He tapped the glowing screen of his laptop and handed me a spare earpiece. I put it on and listened. The audio feed was absolutely pristine. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit inside Derek's office broadcasting perfectly over the encrypted cellular network. The electronic trap was officially set and primed. We had successfully infiltrated the very heart of his fraudulent fortress. Now all we had to do was sit in the shadows, listen carefully, and wait for the arrogant monster to confidently speak his own devastating destruction into existence. The waiting was a completely different kind of torture. 48 excruciating hours had passed, since I slipped out of that sprawling mansion and back into the shadows. Mitchell and I basically lived in that cramped, damp motel room, surviving on lukewarm diner coffee and sheer stubborn adrenaline. We took turns wearing the heavy studio headphones, staring at the digital audio waves on his glowing laptop screen. The silence was maddening. For 2 solid days, we heard nothing but the mundane sounds of a house I used to call my prison. The distant hum of the central air conditioning, the occasional muffled footsteps in the carpeted hallway, Sarah softly calling out for my grandson Leo to come down for dinner. Every time I heard her tired, sweet voice crackle through the small earpiece, my chest physically ached. I wanted to reach through the digital void and pull her out of that toxic environment. I had to constantly remind myself that rushing blindly back in would only guarantee her destruction. I had to let the trap snap shut on its own. It happened on a Friday evening, just as the orange sun began dipping below the motel roofline. I was sitting on the edge of the lumpy mattress, rubbing my aching knees, when Mitchell suddenly held up his hand. His sharp blue eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He quickly tapped a key on his laptop, routing the live audio feed directly through the small external speakers sitting on our wobbly laminate table. A distinct heavy click echoed into the room, followed by the familiar squeak of Derek's solid mahogany office door swinging open. My entire body went instantly rigid. The veteran fire captain inside me immediately stood at attention, completely ready for battle. We heard the dull thud of the heavy door locking into place. Then came the sound of a woman laughing. It was a high-pitched, breathy sound, completely devoid of any real warmth. It was not Sarah. It was Victoria. The wealthy, so-called angel investor who was actively helping my son-in-law dismantle my family. Derek's smooth, arrogant voice washed over the room, making my blood run absolutely cold. "I poured us a drink, babe," Derek said, the clinking of heavy crystal glasses ringing clearly through the hidden microphone. To a flawlessly executed exit strategy. Victoria giggled, a sickening sound that made my jaw clench tight enough to crack a tooth. "Are you absolutely sure the old man is not going to be a problem?" she asked, her voice dripping with lazy entitlement. "What if he talks to the local authorities?" Derek let out a loud, booming laugh. The exact same cruel, arrogant laugh he used at the dinner table when he humiliated me in front of his wealthy venture capitalist friends. "Calvin is completely neutralized," he boasted, his voice vibrating with supreme overconfidence. "I spent the last 6 months convincing Sarah that her precious daddy is losing his mind. I planted the seeds perfectly. I told her his memory is failing, that he is paranoid and combative. When he came crying to her about the financial documents, she practically packed his bags for him. He is currently rotting away in some cheap roadside motel or a state-run nursing home, completely cut off from the only people who would ever believe him." My hands curled into tight fists, my fingernails digging deep into my calloused palms. Hearing the man who stole my life savings casually brag about weaponizing my daughter's love against me was a level of pure evil I had never encountered. "And what about the kid?" Victoria asked, taking a slow sip of her drink. "He is not going to throw a tantrum about that old junk car." Derek scoffed loudly, shifting his weight in his expensive leather chair. "Leo will forget about that rusty old Mustang the second I buy him a new video game console. Selling that piece of garbage was the easiest $85,000 I ever made. The old fool actually thought a classic car would secure his legacy. I used his legacy to buy your diamond earrings, baby." I looked across the table at Mitchell. My brother-in-law's face was completely devoid of color, his jaw set in a hard, furious line. He had spent his entire career at the Internal Revenue Service, tracking down the most vile financial predators in the country, but hearing this level of casual domestic cruelty clearly struck a deep personal nerve. He kept his fingers hovering over the recording software, ensuring every single syllable was perfectly captured and instantly encrypted. Let us talk about the final phase. Derek continued, the tone of his voice shifting from arrogant mockery to cold business calculation. The domestic shell accounts are completely drained. I initiated the final wire transfers this morning. The last batch of venture capital funds and the remaining balance from the high-risk commercial loans are currently washing through the dummy corporation. By Monday morning, the entire sum will be sitting safely in our offshore accounts in Belize. Belize. Victoria purred, the sound of her voice making my stomach violently turn. Warm water, private beaches, and absolutely zero extradition treaties. Are you completely sure your lovely wife is not going to realize what is happening before our flight takes off next Thursday? Sarah is completely clueless, Derek said, dismissing my brilliant daughter as if she were nothing more than a minor accounting error. She signed every single digital document I put in front of her without reading a single paragraph. She thinks she is the managing director of a highly successful tech incubator. When the federal authorities and the aggressive commercial creditors finally realize the millions are missing, they are going to trace every single digital IP address and electronic signature directly back to her personal laptop. I even forwarded the loan confirmation emails to her address just to permanently lock down the federal fraud charges. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, the ice clinking loudly in his glass. By the time the authorities kick the front door down, we will be drinking margaritas on a private beach in Belize, and she will be staring at a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. I will have the lawyers draft a formal statement claiming I am a heartbroken victim of my wife's massive financial deception. I will demand full emergency custody of Leo and leave her to rot behind bars. The sheer demonic perfection of his confession hung heavily in the stale, humid air of our motel room. He had literally spelled out his entire criminal conspiracy, step by step, detail by horrifying detail, directly into the microscopic microphone I had planted under his desk. He proudly admitted to the psychological abuse, the financial fraud, the forgery, the theft of the Mustang, and his explicit intentional plan to frame my daughter for massive federal crimes while he fled the country with his wealthy mistress. Mitchell reached out and firmly pressed the stop button on his keyboard. He quickly saved the pristine audio file, backing it up instantly to 3 different highly secure encrypted cloud servers. He slowly took off his reading glasses, dropping them onto the table with a soft clatter. My chest heaved with ragged, heavy breaths. The pain of hearing that monster talk about my family as if they were disposable garbage was an agonizing physical weight pressing down on my sternum. I desperately wanted to jump into my car, drive straight back to that sprawling mansion, kick the locked mahogany door off its hinges, and drag him out onto the manicured lawn by his expensive silk collar. I wanted to show him exactly what a retired Chicago fire captain could do with his bare hands. But the veteran commander inside me looked at the glowing laptop screen and recognized the absolute undeniable truth. We did not need to use our fists to win this war. We have it. Mitchell whispered, his voice thick with a profound, dangerous satisfaction. We have the smoking gun, Calvin. He just handed us his own head on a silver platter. Every single element of intent, every admission of forgery, and his exact flight itinerary is perfectly preserved on this drive. I stood up from the lumpy mattress, smoothing down my faded flannel shirt. The freezing tactical ice in my veins turned into a solid, unbreakable steel. Derek thought he had completely outsmarted a senile old man and a gullible schoolteacher. He thought he was walking away with millions in stolen blood money, leaving my daughter to face a brutal federal prison sentence. He honestly believed he was the smartest person in the room. But he had just triggered the final massive alarm. We had the irrefutable audio evidence. We had the detailed timeline of his departure. and we were about to bypass the local police entirely. Mitchell was already pulling up the direct contact information for his former colleagues in the elite financial crimes division of the FBI. We were about to bring the full catastrophic weight of the federal justice system crashing down on his arrogant life, and we were going to make absolutely certain he never saw the outside of a concrete cell ever again. The heavy, humid air of early Friday morning clung to my jacket as Mitchell and I stepped out of my rented sedan. We were not parked outside a local police precinct or a generic downtown law office. We were standing in the imposing geometric shadow of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building. I looked up at the towering facade of glass and concrete, feeling the immense weight of the last few agonizing weeks finally begin to shift. For months, Derek had relied entirely on my daughter's trusting nature and my perceived weakness. He honestly thought his polished tech bro vocabulary and his expensive tailored suits made him completely invincible. He assumed his sophisticated financial crimes were far too complex for a retired working-class man to ever comprehend. But he had never factored in the quiet, lethal efficiency of a retired IRS forensic accountant and a veteran fire captain who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Mitchell adjusted the sharp lapels of his beige trench coat and gripped his battered leather briefcase. That worn briefcase held the digital execution of my arrogant son-in-law. We walked through the revolving glass doors, passing the rigorous federal security checkpoints, with the smooth, practiced ease of men who belonged on the right side of the law. Mitchell led me past crowded waiting areas and busy clerks navigating the complex labyrinth of the massive federal building until we reached a set of unmarked, heavy, frosted glass doors on the 9th floor. This was the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, the absolute last place on earth any white-collar criminal ever wants to find themselves. Mitchell did not even have to knock. A tall, sharp-eyed black man in a crisp navy suit opened the door, greeting my brother-in-law with a firm, familiar handshake. This was Special Agent Marcus Vance. Mitchell had personally mentored Marcus nearly 2 decades ago, teaching him exactly how to untangle the most sophisticated offshore money laundering schemes in the country. Marcus ushered us into a sterile, windowless conference room. There were no pleasantries and no unnecessary small talk. The atmosphere inside that room was thick with serious professional gravity. I sat at the cold metal table and watched as Mitchell opened his briefcase. He pulled out the encrypted flash drives and the thick stack of yellow legal pads outlining the entire fraudulent network. He handed the digital portfolio directly to Marcus. Mitchell did not just briefly explain the situation. He orchestrated an absolute masterclass in financial destruction. He laid out the exact architecture of Derek's massive Ponzi scheme. He pointed out the dummy corporations, the fabricated tech startup revenues, and the devastating high-risk commercial loans taken out using my daughter Sarah's stolen identity. But the absolute crushing blow was the audio surveillance. Marcus plugged a secure playback device into the table interface and hit the play button. The small room filled with the sickening, arrogant laughter of my son-in-law and his wealthy mistress, Victoria. We sat in absolute silence as Derek bragged about selling my grandson Leo's vintage Mustang. We listened to his cold, calculated voice detailing his imminent escape to Belize. We heard him explicitly confess to forging Sarah's digital signatures with the direct malicious intent of leaving her to face decades in a federal penitentiary. I watched the muscles in Special Agent Vance's jaw tighten as the recording played. He was a seasoned professional who had dealt with human greed his entire career, but hearing a man gleefully plot the federal imprisonment of his own innocent wife and the abandonment of his young child struck a deep personal chord. Marcus paused the recording and looked directly at me. His gaze was sharp, analytical, and filled with a quiet, dangerous respect. "You did exactly the right thing, bringing this directly to us," Mr. Calvin Marcus stated, his voice low and incredibly steady. "Local jurisdictions would have taken weeks just to establish probable cause for a basic search warrant. By then, your son-in-law would be drinking rum on a private beach in Central America. But this audio is absolute pristine evidence of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, identity theft, and immediate flight risk. We are completely bypassing the standard preliminary review. I am taking this directly to a federal judge within the hour." Over the next 48 hours, I witnessed the terrifying invisible power of the United States federal government in motion. There were no loud sirens. There were no flashing lights or dramatic public arrests. The feds do not operate with loud, chaotic energy. They operate like a massive, silent python, slowly wrapping around their prey and quietly cutting off the oxygen. Marcus and his specialized tactical team executed a series of emergency ex parte court orders. They moved swiftly through the digital banking system, tracing the exact Cayman Islands routing numbers Mitchell and I had provided. While Derek sat comfortably in his lavish downtown office, sipping expensive espresso and pretending to be a brilliant tech visionary, the federal agents were silently and methodically freezing every single drop of his stolen capital. They aggressively locked down his domestic shell accounts. They seized the fraudulent venture capital funds. And most importantly, they completely severed his access to the offshore accounts, holding my stolen retirement money and Sarah's fake loan disbursements. They trapped his blood money in a frozen digital vault that he could no longer reach. Derek was completely unaware that he was now a dead man walking. He thought he was a multi-million-dollar genius preparing for a tropical escape, but in reality, he could not even buy a pack of gum with his frozen credit cards. But freezing the stolen money was only half of our critical battle. I had to ensure that when the federal hammer finally dropped, Sarah would be legally and totally insulated from the massive catastrophic fallout. I could not leave her exposed to the collateral damage of his inevitable arrest. We left the federal building and immediately drove to a prestigious family law firm in the affluent Buckhead district. I needed a shark. I needed the most ruthless, aggressive family law attorney in the state of Georgia. We hired a woman named Diane. She was a fierce, intimidating attorney with a fierce reputation for completely dismantling abusive spouses in family court. She did not waste any time with soft sympathy. She dealt strictly in raw leverage and total legal obliteration. We sat in her plush corner office and I explained everything. I handed her copies of the financial fraud, the forged signatures, and a printed transcript of the audio recording where Derek threatened to take full custody of my grandson, Leo. Diane reviewed the damning documents with cold, predatory efficiency. She immediately began drafting emergency ex parte divorce and sole custody petitions. She worked with astonishing speed, pulling together a massive, impenetrable legal fortress around my daughter. She prepared extensive protective orders designed to completely sever Derek's parental rights the very second the federal agents put him in handcuffs. Diane assured me that with the undeniable evidence of his explicit plan to frame Sarah and flee the jurisdiction, no family court judge in the country would ever grant him a single moment of visitation with Leo. We were legally stripping him of his role as a father and a husband before he even knew he was in a fight. Sitting in that quiet law office, signing my name as an official witness to the custody affidavits, I felt the freezing tactical ice in my veins solidify into an unbreakable wall of steel. I thought about the miserable, damp motel room where Mitchell and I had spent days meticulously mapping out this counterattack. I thought about the dark, suffocating depression Derek had aggressively tried to force upon my beautiful daughter. He had desperately wanted me to feel utterly powerless. He wanted me to believe that an aging, working-class black man from the South Side could never outsmart a wealthy, arrogant tech executive. But I was not just a retired fire captain anymore. I was a father fiercely protecting his own blood. I had successfully marshaled the absolute, full, devastating weight of the federal government and the most ruthless legal representation money could buy. The digital web had been cast perfectly. The invisible steel trap was perfectly set. The offshore financial accounts were locked tight, and the legal guillotine was heavily suspended directly over his neck. We had meticulously built a flawless execution chamber. Now all we had to do was wait for the perfect moment to pull the lever and watch his entire fake universe shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The heavy, humid air of the Georgia evening pressed against the smudged glass of my cheap motel window. But inside my chest, everything was running completely ice cold. It was Thursday night. In exactly 12 hours, Derek was scheduled to board a first-class international flight to Belize with his wealthy mistress, Victoria. He honestly believed he had pulled off the ultimate flawless execution. Tonight, he was hosting a massive, lavish expansion celebration for his fraudulent tech startup at one of the most ultra-exclusive restaurants in downtown Atlanta. He had invited all his wealthy venture capitalist friends, his arrogant business partners, and of course my beautiful, unsuspecting daughter, Sarah. He designed this extravagant party to be his glorious grand finale. A dazzling theatrical smokescreen to distract everyone while he quietly slipped out the back door and left Sarah holding the bag for millions of dollars in federal fraud. He thought he was untouchable. He was dead wrong. Mitchell sat across from me at the wobbly laminate table, snapping his sleek leather briefcase shut with a sharp, definitive click. My brother-in-law had spent the last 48 hours orchestrating a masterpiece of federal financial destruction. The invisible net was already drawn tight. Every single one of Derek's hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands was completely frozen by the federal authorities. His domestic shell companies were locked down. The arrest warrants were actively sitting on a federal judge's desk, waiting for the morning light. But tonight belonged entirely to me. Mitchell reached across the table and slid a thick, heavy manila folder directly into my hands. Inside that plain paper envelope was every piece of damning evidence we had gathered. The wire fraud documents, the audio transcripts, the explicit flight itineraries, and the emergency sole custody papers Diane had drafted to protect Sarah and Leo. I stared down at the thick folder resting in my calloused hands. It felt infinitely heavier than any steel axe or heavy fire hose I had ever carried. 35 years with the Chicago Fire Department. This plain manila envelope was a weapon of mass destruction, aimed squarely at the heart of a calculating psychopath. Mitchell looked at me, his piercing blue eyes filled with a solemn, respectful understanding. He told me the federal agents would move in at dawn, but the personal reckoning was my right as a father. He gave me a firm nod, grabbed his coat, and quietly left the motel room. I was completely alone with the ticking clock and the deafening beat of my own heart. I placed the thick folder carefully on the small nightstand. It was time to get ready for the party. I walked over to the narrow, creaky motel closet and pulled open the flimsy wooden door. Hanging inside, wrapped in a protective plastic cover, was my absolute best tailored charcoal gray suit. It was not just any piece of clothing. It was the exact same suit I had purchased 3 years ago for the darkest day of my entire life. It was the suit I wore when I stood beside a polished mahogany casket and said my final agonizing goodbye to my beautiful wife, Elena. I had not worn it since that devastating afternoon. I had kept it sealed away because it carried the heavy, profound weight of immense grief and unimaginable loss. But tonight, the symbolism felt absolutely perfect. Derek had aggressively tried to use my profound grief over Elena as a weapon against me. He had twisted my mourning into a fake narrative of dementia and senility to brainwash my daughter. Wearing this specific suit tonight was my way of taking that power back. I was honoring my late wife by wearing the armor of my greatest sorrow, to completely obliterate the man who tried to destroy her legacy. I slowly removed the plastic cover, tossing it aside. I stripped off my faded flannel shirt and my worn denim work jeans. I took a long hot shower, letting the steaming water wash away the stale dampness of the roadside motel and the lingering exhaustion of the past 2 weeks. When I stepped out into the humid room, I began to dress with meticulous, deliberate care. I pulled on the crisp white dress shirt, buttoning it all the way to the collar. I slid into the perfectly tailored charcoal trousers, feeling the sharp crease of the fabric against my legs. I stood in front of the peeling bathroom mirror and tied a deep burgundy silk tie, pulling the knot snug against my throat. I slipped my broad shoulders into the heavy gray suit jacket, adjusting the lapels until they sat perfectly flat across my chest. I looked deeply into my own eyes in the smudged reflection. The broken, confused, pathetic old man Derek had tried to create was nowhere to be found. The frail, exhausted victim who had been kicked out of his own home had completely vanished. The man staring back at me was a seasoned, tactical commander. A man who had stared down collapsing roofs and roaring chemical fires without blinking. My dark brown skin looked rich and vibrant. My jaw was set like solid granite, and my posture was perfectly straight. I looked powerful. I looked incredibly dangerous. I reached down and picked up my polished black leather dress shoes, sliding them onto my feet and tying the laces with firm, aggressive pulls. I was no longer playing defense. I was a father walking into a war zone, and I was absolutely ready to bring the entire burning building down on top of the enemy. I walked back into the main room and picked up the thick manila folder from the nightstand. I tucked it securely under my left arm, feeling the solid, undeniable truth pressing against my ribs. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the dingy motel room, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. The lock clicked with a loud metallic finality. I did not look back at the flickering neon vacancy sign or the empty parking lot. I walked directly to my inconspicuous rented sedan and slid behind the steering wheel. The engine roared to life with a low, steady hum. I pulled out onto the busy interstate, merging seamlessly into the fast-moving evening traffic, heading straight toward the glowing skyline of downtown Atlanta. The drive into the city was a surreal blur of flashing streetlights and passing headlights. My mind was completely focused, locked entirely onto the mission ahead. I pictured Derek standing in the middle of that lavish restaurant, surrounded by clinking champagne glasses and obsequious waiters. I pictured his smug, arrogant smile as he accepted the praise and adoration of his wealthy investors. He would be wearing one of his ridiculous custom Italian suits, playing the role of the visionary genius perfectly. He would be looking at his beautiful wife and his innocent son, thinking about how easily he was going to abandon them to the federal wolves in just a few short hours. He thought he had manipulated the entire universe to serve his own selfish, greedy desires. He had absolutely no idea that a massive invisible wrecking ball was currently speeding down the highway, aimed directly at his pristine glass house. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly as I thought about my beautiful daughter, Sarah. I knew she would be at that party, smiling bravely for the cameras, trying desperately to support a husband who was secretly plotting her total destruction. She had been gaslit, manipulated, and mentally abused for months. Tonight was going to be incredibly painful for her. Tonight, she was going to have her heart completely broken and her entire reality shattered in front of a room full of strangers. But a father knows that sometimes you have to break a bone to reset it properly. I had to expose the monster to the bright, blinding light of the truth, so she could finally be free of his toxic grip. I was bringing the pain tonight, but I was also bringing the ultimate cure. I took the downtown exit, the towering glass skyscrapers of Atlanta rising up all around me, like massive illuminated monuments to wealth and power. I navigated the busy streets, pulling up a block away from the ultra-exclusive restaurant Derek had rented out for his grand farewell performance. I parked the sedan in a dark, quiet parking garage, turning off the ignition and sitting in the sudden, heavy silence for one final moment. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath, drawing the humid southern air deep into my lungs. I channeled every ounce of strength, every lesson learned in the firehouse, every ounce of love I held for my family into my core. I stepped out of the car, my polished black shoes echoing sharply against the concrete floor. I walked out of the parking garage and down the bustling city sidewalk. I ignored the crowds of people, the blaring taxi horns, and the vibrant energy of the city nightlife. I was a man on a singular, unstoppable trajectory. The restaurant came into view at the end of the block. It was a stunning modern structure with massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows glowing warmly with elegant ambient light. I could see the silhouette of the crowded party inside. I could see the waiters carrying silver trays and the guests laughing in their expensive evening wear. And right in the center of it all, I saw the monster. I stopped directly in front of the heavy glass doors, smoothing my hands over the lapels of the charcoal suit I had worn to bury the love of my life. I adjusted the thick manila folder under my arm, gripping it like a loaded weapon. Derek had challenged my sanity. He had stolen my savings. He had threatened the freedom of my only daughter. He had underestimated the fierce, relentless love of a father. I reached out and grasped the brass handle of the front door. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. I was going to walk into that room and rain absolute biblical hellfire on the man who tried to bury me. The heavy glass doors swung open, releasing a wave of chilled air and the soft hum of classical string music. I stepped onto the plush carpet, letting my eyes adjust to the dim ambient lighting. This was a place where a single dinner cost more than a working family makes in a month. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting fractured golden light. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women in glittering evening gowns stood in tight circles holding flutes of expensive champagne. Right in the center of the grand dining hall, standing on a small raised platform, was Derek. He looked like the absolute king of his fraudulent castle, holding a microphone and soaking in the polite applause of his wealthy investors. Sarah stood a few feet behind him, wearing a beautiful dark blue dress, but her posture was rigid and her smile was fragile. I gripped the thick manila folder tightly under my arm. The charcoal gray suit I wore, the very same suit I had buried my beloved wife in, felt like a heavy suit of armor. I squared my broad shoulders, letting the seasoned fire captain take control. I began to walk forward, my polished black leather shoes making a slow, rhythmic thud against the hardwood floor. The crowd parted as I moved through them. They probably thought I was a guest arriving late. Derek noticed me almost immediately. His arrogant smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine panic, before his features smoothed into that familiar, sickening sneer. He lowered the microphone and whispered something to a waiter nearby. Within seconds, two large men in dark suits began moving quickly toward me from the perimeter of the room. Derek stepped down from the platform and walked to intercept me, blocking my path to Sarah. He plastered on a look of fake, tragic sympathy for the crowd. "Calvin, what are you doing here?" he said loudly, ensuring the nearby investors could hear his condescending tone. "I told you the doctors wanted you to stay at the facility and rest your mind." Derek turned to the approaching guards, offering them an apologetic shrug. "Gentlemen, please be gentle with my father-in-law," he announced. "He is suffering from severe dementia and gets very confused and combative." Please escort him safely outside before he hurts himself. The two guards reached out to grab my arms, but they severely underestimated the physical strength of a man who spent 35 years pulling victims out of burning buildings. I planted my feet and shoved their hands away with an explosive movement that left them completely stunned. I did not yell. I did not throw a wild punch. I simply locked my eyes onto the guards and spoke with the booming, authoritative voice of a veteran tactical commander. Do not lay another hand on me. I rumbled, my voice vibrating with a freezing, absolute authority that echoed across the dining hall. The deep timbre of my command voice froze the guards in their tracks. It was the exact same tone I used to direct terrified rookies through a roaring inferno. The entire restaurant suddenly fell dead silent. The polite chatter ceased, and the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Every single eye in the room turned toward us. Derek swallowed hard, his confident facade finally beginning to crack under the sudden intense public scrutiny. Before he could utter another manipulative lie, I stepped directly past him and walked straight up the small stairs onto the raised platform. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and plugged it into the auxiliary cable resting on the podium, which fed directly into the massive sound system. Sarah took a cautious step toward me, her beautiful brown eyes filled with deep confusion and absolute terror. "Dad, please, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I looked at my daughter, feeling a wave of protective love wash over my heart. "I am setting you free, baby girl," I said softly. Then I pressed play on my phone and held the microphone directly up to the main speaker. The crisp, high-definition audio recording from Derek's hidden office bug blasted out of the surround sound system, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. The entire restaurant listened in sheer paralyzed shock as Derek's own arrogant voice filled the room. We all heard Derek laughing with his mistress Victoria. We heard him explicitly brag about selling Leo's vintage car. We heard him detail his plan to drain his domestic shell accounts and wire the stolen venture capital straight to the Cayman Islands. The devastating moment came when the recording played Derek's calculated plan for my daughter. His voice boomed over the speakers, bragging about forging Sarah's digital signatures on the fraudulent federal loan applications. "When the authorities kick the front door down, we will be drinking margaritas on a private beach in Belize," his recorded voice announced. "She will be staring at a 15-year sentence in federal penitentiary. I will demand full emergency custody of Leo and leave her to rot behind bars." I hit the stop button, and the abrupt silence that followed was absolutely deafening. The wealthy investors stared at Derek with fury, realizing their millions were gone. But I only watched Sarah. I watched the heavy fog of psychological abuse completely lift from her eyes. The agonizing confusion that had plagued her evaporated, replaced by a blinding righteous wrath. She finally saw the true monster standing in front of her. Sarah squared her shoulders and walked slowly toward her husband. Derek raised his hands, stammering out pathetic, useless excuses. Sarah did not say a single word. She drew her arm back and delivered a massive, open-handed strike directly across his jaw. The violent cracking sound of her hand connecting with his face echoed through the dining hall like a gunshot. Derek stumbled backward, grabbing his stinging cheek, his arrogant kingdom reduced to ashes. The sharp sound of my daughter striking her husband hung in the air of that dining room. It was the undeniable sound of a spell breaking. Sarah stood tall, her breathing heavy, but her eyes finally clear. Derek stumbled backward, bumping into a draped table and knocking over a silver ice bucket. The expensive champagne spilled across the polished floor, pooling around his Italian leather shoes. He raised a trembling hand to his reddened cheek, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He looked at his wealthy venture capitalist friends, expecting them to intervene to protect their golden boy. but those men and women simply stared back at him with absolute freezing disgust. They had heard the audio recording. They knew their millions of dollars were gone, and the man bleeding on the floor was nothing but a cheap thief. Before Derek could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, the heavy main doors of the restaurant burst completely open. The timing was absolutely perfect. It was a flawless orchestration of federal power. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical gear and navy windbreakers emblazoned with yellow letters flooded into the elegant space. They did not shout or wave their weapons wildly. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. Special Agent Marcus Vance led the charge, his badge gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. Derek took one desperate look at the approaching federal agents, and his survival instinct finally kicked in. The smooth-talking tech executive completely vanished, replacing the facade with the raw panic of a cornered rat. He spun around wildly, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the spilled champagne as he sprinted toward the kitchen's swinging doors. He actually thought he could just run away from the United States government. He thought he could outrun his own catastrophic sins. He did not make it past the dessert station. Two massive federal agents intercepted his path with brutal precision. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his custom-tailored suit and violently drove him downward. Derek crashed face first onto a long dining table. Plates of expensive food shattered into pieces. Wine glasses exploded, sending red liquid splashing across the white tablecloths. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood echoed loudly as they pinned his arms aggressively behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. Special Agent Vance stepped up, looking down at the squirming, weeping mess of a man. Marcus recited his Miranda rights with a cold, booming authority, listing the devastating federal charges one by one. Wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, conspiracy to commit flight to avoid prosecution. Every single charge was a heavy nail driven deeply into the coffin of his fraudulent empire. They hauled Derek roughly to his feet. His designer suit was torn and stained with food and spilled wine. His styled hair was a disheveled mess hanging loosely over his sweaty forehead. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire had been reduced to a pathetic, whimpering coward in less than 5 minutes. The agents began marching him toward the exit, but Derek dug his heels into the carpet and turned his desperate, weeping eyes toward me. He looked past the federal agents and focused entirely on the retired fire captain standing calmly on the raised platform. The monster began to beg. He started sobbing loudly, the tears streaming down his face as he pleaded for mercy. "Calvin, please," he choked out, his voice cracking with hysterical terror. "Please, you have to stop them. We are family, Calvin. You are my father-in-law. I love Sarah. I love Leo. Please do not let them do this to me." I stepped down from the platform and walked slowly toward him. The crowded room parted for me in absolute silence. I looked at the man who had stolen my life savings, who had tried to convince my daughter I was losing my mind, who had planned to leave Sarah rotting in a federal penitentiary. I felt absolutely no pity in my heart. The fire inside me had burned away all the mercy, leaving only the cold, hard truth of justice. I stood mere inches from his tear-stained face, looking deep into his terrified eyes. "You sold your soul, son," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. "Now pay the toll." Those words struck him like a physical blow. The last tiny sliver of hope drained completely from his face, leaving behind a hollow mask of pure defeat. He slumped his shoulders, finally realizing that his silver tongue and his manipulative lies possessed zero power in the real world. The federal agents did not give him another second to wallow in his misery. They grabbed him by his arms and aggressively dragged him toward the heavy glass doors. He stumbled and dragged his feet, whining incoherently, as they pulled him out into the humid Atlanta night. The flashing blue and red lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the street, casting long shadows across the restaurant walls. We watched as they shoved him into the back of a dark government SUV, slamming the door shut and sealing him away from society. He was stripped of every single dime he had stolen. He was stripped of his fake prestige, his luxury cars, and every last ounce of his pride. He was leaving this place with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and a guaranteed ticket to a concrete cell. I turned around and looked at Sarah. She was standing quietly amidst the broken glass and overturned chairs, wrapping her arms tightly around her own body. The illusion was dead, but she was safe. Her future and little Leo were entirely secure. I walked over and pulled my daughter into a fierce, warm embrace, burying her face in my shoulder as she began to weep. The storm was over. The dust finally settled over our lives, like the quiet, peaceful morning after a raging, terrifying storm. Derek did not get to charm his way out of a federal indictment. The mountain of digital evidence Mitchell and I handed over buried him completely. The judge handed down a severe, heavy sentence, sending my former son-in-law to a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud and grand larceny. He will have a very long time to think about his arrogance behind those thick concrete walls. My beautiful daughter Sarah was entirely exonerated. Diane, our absolute bulldog of an attorney, moved literal mountains in family court. She secured absolute sole custody of little Leo for Sarah, stripping Derek of any parental rights and ensuring my daughter was legally cleared of every single fraudulent dime he tried to pin on her name. The dark, toxic cloud of gaslighting and manipulation that had suffocated her for so many months finally evaporated. We even scored a massive miracle on the financial front. Mitchell, using his relentless IRS expertise, navigated the offshore maze and recovered the bulk of my stolen retirement funds. We did not go back to that cold, sterile mansion. We pooled our resources and started fresh. Today, Sarah, Leo, and I live together in a beautiful, spacious house in a quiet neighborhood lined with giant old oak trees. The sweet sound of my grandson laughing as he runs across the bright green backyard is the greatest reward I could ever ask for. I have my family back, whole and healing. I am no longer the broken, discarded old man Derek desperately tried to invent. I am exactly where I belong, right at the head of the table, protecting my bloodline and watching my grandson grow up incredibly safe and profoundly loved. I thank God for that. To all the hardworking men and dedicated parents out there listening to my voice, please hear me clearly today. Family is absolutely sacred, but you must never let love blind you to dark deceit. We spend our lives breaking our backs to provide and build a solid foundation for our children. You always have to trust your gut. If something feels wrong in your spirit, it usually is. Protect your hard-earned assets, and never let an arrogant outsider or anyone else make you feel like a useless burden in the very house you helped build. You have earned your respect. If this father's fight for justice resonated with your spirit, please hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss my next real-life stories. And tell me down in the comments, what city or state are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? I love reading your comments and knowing exactly where my brothers and sisters are tuning in from. Keep your eyes open, stay remarkably strong, protect your own, and I will see you in the next story.